The great amphitheater that we know as the Roman Colosseum was commissioned by Emperor Vespasian around 70 to 72 AD. Like any big stadium, it was for the public's enjoyment, where folks could watch various games. Except the games were quite different at times from the kind of games we watch these days. Today, the crowd is thrilled when a ball flies through the air. Back in ancient Roman days, at times, that object might have been someone's freshly severed head. This bloody entertainment enthralled the crowds, and these games were sometimes said to be the bread and circuses that pacified the masses and directed their energy away from life's difficulties. Today we'll look at just how far the Romans went in entertaining the often bloodthirsty people in this episode of the infographic show, The Worst Things That Happened in the Roman Colosseum. As Steven Pinker writes in his book The Better Angels of Our Nature, the past was brutal at times. Today, we eat pizzas that come in boxes decorated with the Roman Colosseum, says Pinker, hardly thinking about the total depravity that happened in there. And so, if tomato sauce drips onto the print of the amphitheater on your pizza box, it's fitting in a way, as the place was often soaked in human and animal blood. Pinker writes that large audiences would cheer when naked women were tied to a stake, physically violated, and sometimes ripped apart by wild animals that the Romans had acquired. A man acting the part of Prometheus would be tied to a rock, but the myth got real when a trained bird would actually rip out his liver. The crowd was delighted. People fought to the death, and the fight wasn't always fair. Pinker reckons about 500,000 people died horrible deaths inside the Roman Colosseum. But let's see what others say. Thrown to the beasts. Live science tells us that the Romans had a contraption that these days we call a seesaw. This was called a petaurua, and it was said to raise the people sitting on it about 15 feet into the air. Now, that's not such an exciting game, but of course the seesaw was only the beginning of the entertainment. What would happen next is wild animals, such as bears, wild boars, leopards, and lions, would be let into the arena, sometimes through trapdoors, so it looked as if they came from nowhere. The men, both naked and with their hands often tied together, would bounce frantically so as not to be the man on the ground. Oh, what fun! It was easy pickings for the starving animals, who would, in the end, rip both men apart. But part of the enjoyment was putting a bet on which guy would last the longest. For the spectators, this was quite the spectacle, as entertaining as the Super Bowl or the World Cup is to people now. Believe it or not, this spectacle known as damnatio ad bestias was just the halftime entertainment between the other games. It happened to men condemned to death, a capital punishment often handed down to runaway slaves, criminals, and enemies of the state. To think people now get Justin Timberlake for the halftime show. When we say we get thrown to the beasts, this is taken from something that literally used to happen. Did anyone survive this? Well, there are stories, but who knows? One such tale says that a slave named Androcles was thrown to a lion, but the lion didn't want to eat him, or even nibble. This wasn't because the lion was full that day, but because the slave said he met the lion while in North Africa and pulled a thorn from its paw. What goes around, comes around. The terrible Emperor Commodus. This emperor was known as a bit of a megalomaniac, and he would often go into the arena to fight in front of the crowds. Except of course the fights were not fair, and he always won. You probably know him as being the bad guy in the movie Gladiator. As the fights were not fair, the Roman people were not too keen on them, but they had no choice but to cheer lest they die a horrible death themselves. It's said Commodus slaughtered 100 lions, some say bears, in the Colosseum. He decapitated a helpless giraffe, also an ostrich, which can't be hard, seeing as he had a lot to aim for. He killed many other wild animals too. As for humans, he would fight them in the arena, but always spare their lives. This was seen as him having a better side, but in private, it said he would finish his competitors off. Possibly his worst feat was to take people in the arena that were missing feet due to accident or illness and then slay them all. Commodus didn't much like disabled people or people born differently from how he expected people to look. Another of his spectacles was to scour Rome for dwarfs, arm them with cleavers, and let them fight to the death. The recreation of myths. Steven Pinker wrote that people would be sent into the arena to play the part of mythological characters such as Prometheus. He was a trickster type of titan who created man from clay, gave him fire, and pretty much defied the gods in doing so. His punishment was to be tied to a rock for eternity, except each day would be Groundhog Day, and an eagle, really Zeus in animal form, would rip out his liver. That liver would come back the next day, and the scene would take place ad infinitum. The Romans would play this out with a trained bird, according to Pinker, while other sources say the man's stomach would be cut open and any number of wild beasts would come and feast. He didn't get to do it again the next day like in the myth though. The Smithsonian writes that the myth of Orpheus would also be played out. Orpheus was kind of like one of those people on the cover of Jehovah's Witness Watchtower magazines, as he could sit among wild animals and feel only love from them. In fact, it said he could charm anything that lived just by playing music with his lyre. The Romans put a little bit of a dark bend on the story when it was reenacted in the Colosseum. Instead of charming the wild animal with his lyre, the man playing Orpheus would be ripped to shreds by a wild bear. We're not sure if this was supposed to be ancient Roman satire. Just slaughter. The Smithsonian tells us that at times the entertainment didn't involve much human blood being spilled, rather the fun was just slaughtering wild animals. The more exotic, the better. This was because showing the people what strange animals they had found symbolized just how powerful the Romans were. They could travel to distant lands and bring back prizes that looked like monsters to the public. These animals didn't have a chance as they were up against Venators, the best Roman hunters dressed in lots of armor and holding long spears. The favorite animals to be killed were anything with big teeth such as lions, tigers, and leopards, but other slaughter included elephants, bears, ostriches, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and giraffes. The Smithsonian writes that Emperor Titus had 9,000 animals killed in the arena. Emperor Trajan had 11,000 of these wild beasts killed. Women too. One of the great spectacles, for some people at least, was to see women fighting to the death. This didn't happen anywhere near as often as men were forced to kill each other, but it happened. As the women were usually weaker, they might be pitted against a dwarf, each armed with a club or a knife. Sometimes the women were highly trained gladiators, at other times they were just victims being harshly punished. And sometimes it chanced that someone had specified in his will that the most beautiful women he had bought must fight among them. Wrote Nicholas of Damascus, Septimius Severus banned women fighting in 200 AD. Squashed. Another form of animal-related capital punishment was being squashed to death by an elephant. Historian Alison Futrell wrote in her book, Blood in the Arena, that army deserters would sometimes be marched into the arena, after which an elephant killed them by sitting on them. It's written that getting elephants or other wild animals to fight or follow orders in front of thousands of screaming people was not easy. Imagine training a bird of prey to rip out a liver. To do this, they had to be trained by what were called bestiari. The word also meant the people who would be fighting with the animals. There was even a school where people were trained to fight with these beasts, called the bestiariorum. I'm not going in. As you can imagine, the prisoners that were about to be sent to a horrid and painful death were not keen on dying this way in front of cheering spectators. So many took their own lives before they were sent in. It's written that there was a mass suicide of Saxon prisoners. 29 men strangled each other before they could be killed by the beasts. Roman historians wrote that one man thrust his head into a moving cartwheel, breaking his neck. A better way to go than being eaten alive by a lion. Another man forced a toilet sponge down his throat and choked himself to death. Roman philosopher Lucius Annius Seneca wrote about that, saying, "What a brave fellow, he surely deserved to be allowed to choose his fate. How bravely he would have wielded a sword." If you've read this philosopher, you'll know part of his philosophy is about accepting life's hardships and looking death straight on. Easy for him to say, he never experienced the prospect of being chewed on by a hungry bear. Carpophorus. It's said that this bestiary was one of the best animal fighters ever seen in the arena. The story goes that he fought and killed 20 wild beasts in one day. It's also said he was a bit of a Dr. Dolittle and was a great animal trainer. Some historians say this might not be true, but there are sources that tell us he would train wild animals to violate women. He did this by waiting until female animals were in heat and then collect that smell, which makes them attractive to the male of the species. He would then rub that on female slaves, and the spectacle of an animal, even a giraffe, violating a woman in the arena would be greeted with loud cheers from the crowd. In the book, Those About to Die, it is written, Carpophorus used up several women before he got the animals properly trained. With a bull or giraffe, the women didn't usually survive the ordeal. Apparently, such a spectacle was to represent myths, as the god Zeus was said to have done such things when he had taken the form of an animal.
The Roman Empire seemed unbeatable at its peak. One of the largest empires the world had ever seen, it fended off all of its military foes. It built a complex administrative state that ruled regions from Egypt to Spain to England and as far east as modern-day Iraq. At its height, it seemed like it would rule forever. And today, it's a distant memory. Why did the Roman Empire ultimately fall? Did it meet an enemy too powerful to fend off? Was it undone by an internal conflict? Or did it simply stretch itself too thin? The answer isn't any one of those, and the empire's downfall happened over hundreds of years. To find the truth of the Roman Empire's fall, we have to go back to how it became an empire in the first place, because initially it was a republic with far less territory. The republic had taken over from the previously flawed monarchy, but the people seemed to be calling out for a more unified government. One man was more than willing to answer that call, Julius Caesar, the man appointed perpetual dictator of Rome in the mid-1st century BCE. He started consolidating power, becoming a popular and effective ruler who won many military campaigns, and many of his rivals realized he had no intention of giving up his newfound power. The elites of Rome assassinated him, setting off one of the biggest political crises in Roman history. Civil wars kicked off as many people sought to claim power, and in the end, the wars saw Octavian, the adopted son of Caesar, take power. He continued his father's legacy, conquering nearby territories including Egypt, ending that country's Hellenistic era. Soon, he was more powerful than his father ever was, and the Roman Senate responded accordingly. They granted him the title of Augustus, allowing him to rule in perpetuity, and soon no one would dare challenge his power. The plotters who feared Caesar's role as dictator had accidentally created the rise of Rome's first emperor, and he wouldn't be the last. From then, Rome would not only become another monarchy ruled by a series of hereditary leaders, both good and bad, but it would develop hunger for conquest that would envelop a large part of Europe and parts of Asia and Africa. While Italy would continue to serve as the center of the empire, other territories would be organized into provinces, each administered by a local governor with drastically different approaches to leadership. The empire would soon be so large that it would be impossible for one leader to maintain full control over every territory, which meant the provinces would still maintain some level of autonomy, as long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause any problems that would arouse the ire of the emperor. And the system seemed to be working. The empire was stable enough that the next 2 centuries became largely known as Pax Romana. But under the surface, trouble was brewing. During the 1st century CE, religious conflicts started brewing under the surface. The Roman Empire largely worshipped the traditional pantheon, led by Jupiter, and heavily tied to the Greek pantheon led by Zeus. This polytheistic faith was characterized by ornate temples dedicated to the individual gods and a wild lore that made the gods seem rather petty and human. Jupiter's dalliances with human women and gods taking revenge for the most petty grievances were both common staples of the faith in those days, and then came Christianity. Spinning out of the teachings of the Jewish rabbi known as Jesus and his eventual crucifixion by the Roman authorities, this new Abrahamic faith was based off the often persecuted faith of Judaism and largely received the same treatment in the early days. While some of the more dramatic stories, like early Christians being fed to lions, have no historical backing, the Roman Empire saw new faiths as a threat to the establishment. But religions aren't easy to kill. The conflict stayed under the radar, and Christianity was mostly a small faith during those early years, and a wise emperor would have likely focused on maintaining the empire's stability rather than persecuting heathens. But when you have a monarchy, you're often relying on the whims of birth order and genetics, and in the year 177, Rome's luck ran out. The new emperor, Commodus, would soon become infamous for this exact reason. The youngest emperor ever at the age of 15, his rule was dictated by his emotions, which led to recklessness. A teenager making bad decisions when given too much power? Perish the thought. As he was inheriting the empire built by many of his predecessors, it was hard for him to screw up the larger things. But back in Rome, he wasted no time throwing things into chaos. He was known for his fickle and dictatorial leadership style, as well as his love of the gladiator matches in the Colosseum. He would even participate in duels himself, which largely meant anyone who faced off against him would probably be expected to die quietly. He built a cult of personality around himself, and his reign was so chaotic that he would eventually be immortalized by Joaquin Phoenix as a villain in the Oscar-winning movie Gladiator. And his reign ended as it began, with chaos. Commodus was assassinated by a wrestler in Roman baths after 15 years in charge, and things would only get more chaotic from there. The Roman Senate declared him a public enemy and tore down his statues, and he was succeeded by a new emperor in what would become known as the Year of the Five Emperors. It was 193 CE, and civil war ensued. The next emperor would be assassinated only 3 months after taking office. His successor would essentially pay off the guards to let him become emperor, and he would be ousted and executed only weeks later. The chaos would only die down when 2 emperors, Septimus Severus and Claudius Albinus, ruled simultaneously, despite both considering the other to be a threat. Rome's political climate was in complete chaos, and soon people outside would start noticing. Many of the provinces of Rome had been semi-autonomous for a long time and had developed their own cultures. So as the Roman state spiraled into chaos, they started to wonder, why not just make it official? As the Romans struggled through a series of weak, crazy, and inconsequential emperors, often in quick succession, the territory started to break away at an increasing rate. First came the self-declared Gallic Empire, which took most of the territory of modern-day France and England with it. Then came the Palmyrene Empire, which was led by Queen Zenobia and took over much of Egypt and the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, including many key sites in the Holy Land. It was the biggest crisis in Rome's history, but it would bring many changes with it. A series of 3 emperors in the 3rd century would bring this crisis to an end, but the Roman Empire that emerged from it would not be the same. First was Aurelian, who only reigned for 5 years, but had a huge impact. At the time, the diminished Roman military was under attack by barbarian tribes and internal strife, and it seemed like the empire's days might be nearing an end. But Aurelian had risen through the ranks of the military and knew its workings well, and under his reign he fended off the attacking tribes and conquered both the Palmyrene Empire and the Gallic Empire. He surrounded Rome with mighty walls, abandoned provinces that were too much trouble to keep, and improved Rome's economy. Under his short tenure, Rome started to look more like it did at his peak. His successors would build on his work. Diocletian would reign for 20 years and was also a military veteran, but most of the military work had been completed already. He would focus his efforts on improving the empire's stability, which included creating a system of regional courts that would give the empire more control over its far-flung provinces. While the empire had reclaimed the territory lost to the breakaway provinces, Diocletian started expanding once again. And by the end of his 20 years, he became the first Roman emperor to abdicate his position voluntarily, retiring to his palace. But his successor might have had an even bigger impact. The 31-year run of Constantine the Great would be among the most successful in the empire's history. He introduced a new currency, expanded the empire's territory, and reorganized the army to be more effective. But his most significant change was his conversion to Christianity, reportedly spurred on him by seeing a cross in the sky. As the Roman emperor converted, so did many of the citizens of Rome, igniting Christianity's rise to becoming a world power religion. At the end of his reign, the empire's territory was near its peak, expanding as far east as Byzantium. After his death, Constantine left the empire to his sons, starting a dynasty which would then rule over Rome. The Roman Empire looked as healthy as ever, and many people assumed that this was the beginning of a new golden age. So, how could things go so very wrong? The year was 337 CE when Constantine passed away, and while Constantine's reign had been full of successes, there was trouble lurking under the surface. His embrace of Christianity had given the church massive power in Rome, and although many supported him in his decision, there were some who didn't wish for the empire to fall under the grasp of Christianity. Enemies of the state were executed and their estates were given to those he favored. The military was paid well, but soon the soldiers seemed to be engaging in blatant corruption. But the empire was still the greatest power in the world, and it was hard to imagine anyone challenging it. But empires aren't immune from internal strife. In the aftermath of the death of Constantine, the throne of the empire was once again open for contest, and this era led to many conflicts over who would take control. His sons initially ruled jointly, but chaos would follow, and Rome would be plunged into civil war. Many territories were taken over by local leaders, with territories going back and forth at the whims of the military victories. Despite this, the core of the empire was unchallenged. And by 379, a new emperor named Theodosius had risen. A proven general, he would become one of Rome's greatest military leaders and would put an end to the era of strife. But far greater threats were brewing beyond the borders of Rome. As far-reaching as Rome's borders were at the time, it was hard to believe that a nomadic people from a continent away would throw the whole thing into chaos. But the Huns were no ordinary nomads. Fierce warriors, they'd been making inroads into Asia and Eastern Europe, and where they went, people fled. Their massive takeover of territory had led to the Gothic tribes to flee toward the Roman Empire. Suddenly, the Romans had a huge influx of barbarian warriors fleeing across their border, and Rome's lack of management in their border states came back to haunt them. A well-organized government might have been able to resettle these new residents and incorporate them into the Roman states, even using their warrior smarts to reinvigorate the military. Unfortunately, the corrupt local officials instead chose to exploit them, assuming they weren't a threat. They would be proven very wrong. Now the Romans had a large number of outside warriors within their borders. These guests had seen Roman hospitality was lacking, and so they quickly took up arms. They were joined by other tribesmen heading over the border, and what started as a refugee crisis quickly turned into a guerrilla war. While Rome had a superior military force, it was also spread out and concentrated in the cities, and the forces that were sent to confront the Goths found the invaders fought much harder than expected. The elites felt very little of the crisis. They were kept safe in their walled cities, but across the massive expanses of the Roman countryside, the Goths quickly gained territory and claimed the land of former Roman subjects across the Balkans. And Theodosius might have neglected this problem a bit too much. The emperor may have restored Rome's military in some ways, but the coffers were still looking kinda bare after decades of patronage under his predecessors. He raised taxes to confront the barbarians and was met with rebellions from the people he ruled over. He also cracked down on other faiths, doubling down on Constantine's embrace of Christianity, and even persecuted believers of other variants of Christianity. Soon he was facing new rebellions in the west, seeking to end his rule, with rebel leader Magnus Maximus declaring himself emperor in 383 and taking over the territory of Gaul. This led to significant losses in territory and troops until Maximus made a failed attempt at defeating Rome itself and was ultimately defeated in 388. Rome once again became the greatest power on the planet. But soon this would all change. By 395 CE, Theodosius I would die, leaving behind him a weakened army and no clear successor. His two sons would each claim the empire, but neither was a capable leader, leaving their ministers to essentially take charge of the situation. Rather than go to another brutal civil war only a decade after the last, the two halves of the empire essentially went their own separate ways. One emperor, Arcadius, took the Eastern Roman Empire, which would become known as the Byzantine Empire in the future, while the other son, Honorius, would take the western part, including Rome itself. It was the biggest loss of territory for Rome yet, and this time there would be no going back. The Byzantine Empire would endure, lasting another 1,000 years with a power base in the city of Constantinople. It would never reach the world-defining power of the Roman Empire, though. As for Rome, it still ruled much of Europe, but its days were drawing short. Without the massive territory now owned by the Byzantines, administering the empire was much more manageable, but it also meant the massive barbarian invasions were harder to control. The leader of the Huns, Attila, was one of the most feared military leaders of all time, and now he placed his full attention on taking Rome. It would be a death of 1,000 cuts for the Roman Empire. Over the next 80 years, the Roman Empire dealt with brutal attacks from the Huns on their fringes and the Gothic population throughout the empire. The Roman military was a shadow of what it used to be, and it frequently found itself in retreat. The territory of the empire shrunk piece by piece, and Rome started to look less like a powerful empire and more like a city in decline. Some leaders would manage to restore the military strength, but none would get it back to the level where it could reclaim significant amount of territory. The empire would limp along until 476, when one ambitious king decided it was time to strike the final blow. His name was Odoacer, and the mostly forgotten figure might have been one of the most important people in history. The last emperor of Rome, Romulus Augustulus, had a mighty name, but was only a 16-year-old boy when Odoacer invaded. The barbarian king surprisingly dealt kindly with the young king as he sacked Rome, accepting his surrender and allowing the boy to remain alive. He sent him away to live with relatives, even granting him a pension, before declaring himself the ruler of Italy. Probably the most dramatic firing from a first job a teenager's ever experienced. But now the Roman Empire was over. Or was it? That depends on how you define it, because now Odoacer ruled what was left of it. But he was considered a foreign occupier. The Roman Senate didn't consider him a legitimate Roman ruler and instead transferred the seal of Rome to the Eastern Empire, so the greatest empire in history passed into legend. Or did it? The Roman Empire as a government was no more, but its greatest institution still remained, the Roman Catholic Church. It was still in its infancy, less than 500 years old, but its faith had spread very quickly and would soon grow its roots in most of Europe. As the church spread, so did its power, and for the best part of the next 1,000 years, it would be the de facto government in much of Europe. Even kings would answer to it, and few would challenge the Pope's power, until Henry VIII would start his own religion when the church wouldn't let him get divorced. So, while the Roman Empire did not control Europe anymore, the church's legacy far outlived it. But why did the empire actually fall? There's no one reason why the Roman Empire crumbled, but many factors played a role, few bigger than the collapse of its military. Rome's army was once the most powerful in the world, and it attracted the best with good pay. But as the empire's coffers declined, it soon struggled to recruit new troops effectively. This led to emperors filling out the ranks with foreign mercenaries who neither had the skills nor the loyalty of previous armies. Many even came from the invading armies they were fighting, and the effectiveness of their fighting forces suffered. They tried to make up for the personnel problem, but that just made things worse. Many emperors consistently overspent on the military, and that didn't make it any easier to manage. The huge territory they had to govern made it nearly impossible to communicate effectively, and with no email or Teams groups to share important memos, it was often a matter of weeks or months before key changes in policy were communicated. As the empire got larger and larger, this became a bigger problem, and soon the empire was more focused on protecting its key cities than effectively managing its whole territory. But inside Rome, things weren't doing much better. One of the biggest problems with Rome in its last days was the lack of strong leadership, right up to the top. Being Roman emperor was not a great job. Given that it was an appointed position that came with near unlimited power, a lot of people wanted it, and that meant that getting the job came with massive risks. At one point, between the 2nd and 3rd centuries, over 20 men had the title in less than 75 years, and the most common way to be fired from the job was with a knife between your ribs. Turns out Julius Caesar was a trendsetter. When an emperor did manage to hold on to power for years, there was a good chance they would essentially turn the empire into their own personal patronage mill, appointing their allies to powerful positions, and the emperor's bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, would often take matters into their own hands and assassinate emperors when they became more trouble than they were worth. With a government like this, is it any wonder the empire began crumbling? All of these factors came together, spelling the end for the Roman Empire. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been unchallenged on a military level. Their expeditions would face little to no opposition, and their army could largely sweep into a territory and take it over as they pleased. Conquering the new territories often meant having to build new infrastructure that would increase the quality of life in the region in some ways, as well as enforcing the rule of Roman Empire on its newly acquired citizens. So the army wound up being more of an enforcement arm of the Roman government, and it was no longer prepared to deal with major military conflicts. So when the outsiders, such as the Goths, came calling after being pushed out of their territory by the Huns, the Roman military wasn't formidable enough to maintain its borders. And it all came down to one fatal mistake. If the military was well prepared for the invasion, odds are they could have defeated the Goth armies and defended their territory. They were better trained and had superior weaponry than the Goths, but once the Goths had managed to enter the fringes of the empire, it was going to be much harder to displace them without major military operations. The Romans ultimately chose the worst option of all. They didn't aggressively repel the Goth invaders and defend their borders, but they also didn't welcome them into the empire and take advantage of this new manpower like they could have. Instead, they exploited them and hired them while never letting them develop any loyalty to the empire. And this led to constant civil wars and small military skirmishes, growing tension, and a slow but sure loss of territory. And it all could have been avoided if the empire coordinated a better response to the Goths seeking refuge within the borders of the Roman Empire. A Marine platoon is in uncharted territory. Their mission has taken an unexpected turn, and they now find themselves in unfamiliar surroundings. It's not clear where they are, but as they'll soon find out, it's not a question of where, it's a question of when. Because coming over the hill is a massive group of soldiers wearing armor and carrying shields and spears. No, it's not a team of historical reenactors, it's a Roman legion, all 5,200 of them, and they look ready to fight. Who would win if a modern-day Marine platoon went head-to-head with an entire Roman legion? Let's look at the tail of the tape. In terms of size, it's really not a competition. Marine platoons are made up of combat infantry meant to take and hold enemy objectives. They're highly trained and are used for both close quarters and ranged assaults. You'll usually find a team of 43 soldiers led by a platoon commander, usually a second lieutenant. He'll be backed up by 2 or 3 sergeants, a platoon guide directing the march, a messenger who delivers key intel, and 3 weapon squads who are here to deal out the punishment. For the Marines, it's about quality, not quantity. And for the Roman legion, it's the exact opposite. If you looked at this battle from the air, it might look like a little baby lion running from a herd of wildebeest. We're still kinda sad about that scene. The Roman legion is big, really big, a massive unit consisting of over 5,000 Roman soldiers. The vast majority of its forces are foot soldiers. They're backed up by several hundred cavalry soldiers who generally ride on horseback. During the latter days of the Roman Empire, it was common for them to be backed up by several hundred auxilia soldiers, often foreign mercenaries who joined the legion for pay. The primary goal of this army was to create an impression of overwhelming force, occupying regions and fending off invading armies. In those days, Rome could win many battles with sheer force of numbers. But times have changed. So in numbers, the Marines are outmatched. But it's not all about the numbers, because in terms of arms, 2,000 years can change a lot. The Roman legion was well armed for their day, but their weapons were largely meant for close-range fighting. They would typically carry a dagger on their body called a pugio that was meant for close-quarters combat. A longer iron sword was usually their primary weapon, varying in length. In terms of longer-range weapons, the primary one was a spear. This sharp-tipped tool could be used for thrusting against enemy forces, or thrown in a pinch if you had good aim, that is. Of course, then you had to get it back. As for ranged weapons, the options were limited. Some soldiers carried sharp-tipped lead-weighted darts called plumbate, but those were only used later in the Roman Empire's history. The more common tool was a basic mechanical crossbow, which could fire arrows in rapid succession and cut down enemy soldiers before they got too close. The Roman legion would also carry entrenching tools such as sickles and pickaxes that were primarily used to clear terrain, but could also find themselves in the head of an enemy soldier if needed. Offensive weapons were pretty basic, and so were defensive options. While not all troops wore armor, the high-level soldiers would often wear metal torso armor and helmets. This protected them from sudden attacks, but the armor often had weak points and wasn't foolproof. Still, against an army with similar equipment, it was better than nothing. Chainmail was common because it was more lightweight and maneuverable than solid armor. Horses often wore armor as well, because if the steed went down, so did the rider. But while the armor was advanced for its day, it became weaker due to cost-cutting and corruption in the later days of the Empire. The Marines do not suffer such shortfalls. What the Marines lack in numbers, they make up for in firepower. In a big way, every member of the 43 Marines will usually be equipped with an M27 infantry automatic rifle, the basic weapon of the Corps. Holding 30 rounds at a time, it can fire a sustained 36 rounds a minute, which can travel at least 600 meters. They might be backed up by grenade launchers and mortar launchers, which each pack an explosive payload and can take out large numbers of enemies in a single go. They also might carry a handgun, a multi-purpose blade, a non-lethal weaponry like pepper spray and stun grenades for crowd control and neutralizing enemies for capture. They also carry old-fashioned bayonets that are used for cutting down brush as well as self-defense. And that's just the offensive tools. The Marines usually wear protective vests designed to protect them from shrapnel while also protecting them from most bullets. Helmets provide protection and can be equipped with visual tools like night vision goggles for better visibility. So while there are only 43 Marines compared to 5,200 Roman legionnaires, in terms of gear, it's not even close. So let the battle begin. The Marines quickly raise their weapons prepared for action against these strange, crudely armed warriors. The Roman legion reacts just as quickly, raising their spears and issuing demands for surrender. Uh-oh, does anyone speak Latin? Probably not. Soon the combat is on and it's going to be a slaughter one way or another. Is there any way for the Roman legion to win? It's possible, but not easy. The Marines aren't used to close-quarters combat on this level, and while they have no shortage of effective tools, they could become overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They do have one big disadvantage. Each Marine is a large percentage of their manpower and firepower. If the combat begins in a close-quarter scenario and several go down right away, it becomes much harder for the survivors to fend off the much bigger army. That means they'll go down one by one and be forced to retreat, and the few survivors will still be up against a massive force, even if they've whittled it down significantly, at which point it just becomes a game of attrition. But that's the worst-case scenario for the Marines, and it's not particularly likely. Each Marine's battle rifle can reach out over 600 meters and put the hurt on somebody, giving the modern-day warriors a massive advantage over their Iron Age attackers. The Roman legion is also being courteous by giving the Marines a single solid wall of shields and men to shoot at. And not even the sturdiest Roman shield is going to stand up to the kinetic energy of a 5.56mm round. Dozens of Romans will be dead within seconds of the advance starting toward the Marine position, but there's a whole lot more Romans than there are Marines, which is why the Marine platoon has brought along a few great equalizers from the future. First up is a volley of 40mm grenades from the fire team's designated grenadiers. These explosive little Easter eggs have a range of 350 meters for area targets and a kill radius of 5 meters, wounding out to 15. Each platoon will have at least 3 to 4 of these grenadiers, typically carrying at least 18 grenades each. There's a whole lot of boom for Roman legionnaires to charge through. Up next, it depends on if we're sending a new Marine platoon back in time to fight the Romans or a more classic formation. That's because in the 2020s, the Marine Corps had started experimenting with changing the traditional composition of a platoon, eliminating many positions it's had for decades, such as the dedicated machine gunners. The Marine Corps' new battle rifle allows any Marine to potentially be an automatic rifleman, and the Corps decided that precision matters more than volume of fire in future conflicts. Only time will tell if this is right. However, let's go with a traditional platoon formation, as the Corps has operated with it for years. This means that the charging Romans will have to face the wrath of up to 3 machine guns, typically lighter weapons such as the M249, though they could be facing the big bark and big bite of the M240. These weapons have frightful rates of fire, and a charging Roman legion is the perfect target, with the enemy soldiers lining up neatly in rows and just begging to be mowed down. With ranges in the hundreds of yards, Romans are going to be dying by the dozens before they've made any significant progress. And then there's the M3A1 MAS, or Multi-Purpose Anti-Armor Anti-Personnel Weapon System. At least one rifleman in the platoon will be carrying this bad boy, along with a small supply of rockets. In the anti-personnel role, the MAS delivers high explosives that can reach out and touch somebody up to 800 meters away. While ammo is limited, the sheer killing and wounding power of the MAS against tightly packed enemy formations is not to be understated. Unless the Romans are suicidally one-track minded about getting to the Marines, we're going to be seeing a lot of braking and running within the first 2 minutes of being on the wrong end of a modern American Marine platoon's firepower. But our Marine platoon just happens to bring another gift back in time with them, an attached mortars section. Typically, mortars are attached as their own independent platoon, but this time, an entire mortar section got sucked back in time with our Marines to give ancient Rome a taste of modern American firepower. Armed with M252 mortars, the high explosive rounds fired can have a kill radius of up to 115 feet. Exploding inside a densely packed Roman formation, a few rounds from each mortar will be enough to seriously level the playing field. Because, after all, the Romans have the decisive numbers advantage here. But the Romans had more tricks than you might expect. Roman infantry was usually deployed in 3 ranks to provide backup in the event the first line was overwhelmed and to surprise an enemy with overwhelming force if they got the advantage. Their weaponry might have been basic, but their tactics definitely were not. The generals developed complex battle plans that made it easy to confuse and ambush the enemy. The first flank would often start by throwing their javelins, hoping to throw the enemy into chaos and take out some important figures before they were able to respond. So the Marines might wind up facing multiple waves of Roman attackers. How would that go? Well, it all depends on one question. The Romans' only chance to win is if they got the jump on the Marines to take out the core of their platoon, skewing the odds heavily in their favor. Even with their full numbers, the Marines are facing bad odds in terms of numbers. To defeat an entire Roman legion, these elite soldiers will have to take out approximately 121 soldiers each. That sounds impossible, but the difference in equipment is a real game changer here. The Romans have few ranged weapons, and their armor was not designed to sustain a hit from a high-caliber bullet and automatic rifles. Meanwhile, the Marines' body armor was designed to protect from things far more powerful than arrows and javelins. But quantity is a quality all its own. Do the Marines have enough bullets to take on 5,200 troops at once? The average soldier in the Army, Air Force, and Marines carries 7 30-round magazines for their rifle. That's 210 bullets per soldier. Multiplied by 43, we've got a total arsenal of over 8,600 bullets, which means the platoon literally has a bullet for every man in the Roman legion. But anyone who's played a shooting game knows that every bullet doesn't always go where it's intended. The odds are there will be a lot of misfires and maybe even a little panic when the shooting begins. Some ammo is going to be wasted, but the military has a cushion of over 3,000 bullets. Odds are the Roman legion is going to be mostly wiped out by the time the Marine platoon's ammo is expended. But close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Let's say that these Marines aren't quite on their game today. After all, traveling in time to fight an ancient army can be stressful. So they're out of ammo for their M27s, and they've only wiped out about 90% of the Roman legion. Now there are around 500 pissed-off Romans coming to avenge their countrymen, and the battlefield got a lot more even. The Marines do carry pistols as well, the Sig Sauer M17, and this gives them several hundred new shots against their enemy. However, these guns aren't quite as high-powered and cannot be used at long ranges, so odds are they won't do quite as much damage. Still, Marines could be able to take out several hundred more legionnaires as they approach, although they may start taking some losses of their own from flying arrows and javelins at close range. We're close to the end now, but can the Marines finish the job? The final battle might come down to close-range combat, as the out-of-ammo Marines fall back on their non-lethal weaponry and blades to eliminate the small remaining group of Roman legion soldiers. One by one, this would be an even match, and the Romans may even have the edge. After all, they're used to fighting with swords and other blades, while the Marines primarily fight with ranged weapons. But there's one factor that will shift the tide: the Marines' tear gas supply. The Marines slip on their protective eyewear, throw a few grenades, and the Romans suddenly find themselves covered in painful gas that makes it nearly impossible to see. And that's when the Marines come and finish the job in a way the Romans are all too familiar with: a bayonet in hand. In the end, the Roman legion is a powerful fighting force that gave the Marines a tough fight, but no matter the numbers advantage, they simply don't have an answer for the superior firepower and multiple combat tactics of a U.S. Marine platoon. When it comes to cruel and unusual punishments, you could say the Romans took things to the extreme. A persecuted Christian or an unruly slave might just be executed by beheading. And while that sounds like a tough kind of justice, the Romans might have thought it was merciful. After all, the worst offenders might suffer the humiliation and agony of crucifixion. Any sane person would have begged for beheading rather than being crucified. Other offenders could suffer perhaps an even worse fate, and that was quite literally being thrown to the wolves or the lions or leopards, or even being squashed by an elephant. And then there's the punishment we'll talk about today, and we'll let you decide where it stands in the ranking of Roman executions. First of all, this show has nothing to do with the kind of firework you've heard of that goes by the name of the Roman candle. Those fireworks that fill the air with an explosion of stars don't come from Rome, but were created on the other side of the world in China. Nonetheless, the Roman candle we're going to talk about today does relate to fire and a form of entertainment. Let us explain. You might have heard of something called the Great Fire of Rome, and that's supposed to have happened in 64 AD. This destroyed large parts of Rome and entire neighborhoods went up in flames. Nobody knows exactly how it started, but it's generally thought strong winds carried the flames through the narrow streets lined with many timber dwellings. The emperor at the time was a man named Nero, who has gone down in history as perhaps Rome's most villainous character. Some Roman historians wrote about how tyrannical and corrupt this man was, as well as deranged at times. Past and present historians disagree as to the validity of just how crazy this man was, and also what part he had in the fire. Some accounts of the fire come from Roman historians who weren't actually there for the thing. But those accounts are all that exist. There's a possibility that Nero actually had arsonists start the fire so he could rebuild parts of Rome in his own image. If he really was a tyrannical egomaniac, that might make sense. We have the saying Nero fiddled while Rome burned, to kind of represent how this man was far from the flames while his people suffered. Violins weren't even invented back then, but the phrase is just supposed to mean he was playing music and having a good time as Rome went up in flames. Maybe the fire was an accident, or maybe Nero had it set. Or maybe some arsonists did it who weren't connected to anyone in power. We really don't know, but accounts tell us that Nero blamed minorities for the fire, and they included Christians and Jews. Some historians believe that Nero just punished people accused of being the fire starters, and only years later were said to be Christians. Someone was used as a scapegoat for burning down most of Rome, and that could have been these minorities. Christian historians would certainly say it was people of their religion who were punished for the fire, but again, it's not all that clear. The most talked about death was St. Peter, and some accounts have him being crucified. He became a martyr by the hands of Nero, but this was written years after the fact. St. Paul, in some accounts, was beheaded for the fire, and in one legend, his head bounced 3 times, and each time water erupted from the place it hit. So these were allegedly 2 of Nero's victims after the fire, according to some stories. We apologize for not being able to tell you exactly what happened, but many things have been written and historians and theologians will disagree over the matters today. Some say Christians were never even discussed by Roman historians at the time, while others say at the time of the fire it's not clear Christians even thought of themselves as Christians. A Roman historian named Tacitus wrote about Nero's wrath after the fire, but again, this was many years after the fact. He wrote that a lot of Christians were being rounded up and then interrogated, after which some suffered the worst kind of death. Being covered in animal skins and then ripped apart by dogs was one of them. That historian wrote, Nero fastened guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on the Christians who were hated for their abominations. We might not have clarity as to exactly which people and groups were blamed, tortured, and executed after the fire, but most agree Nero did meter out some nasty punishments. And finally, we come to the Roman candle. It went down something like this. A person is sentenced to death, but Nero wants the pain to last some time. He also wants the spectacle to be a kind of entertainment, so he came up with a plan to take a person and cover them with flammable material, but not so flammable that the person would go up in flames very quickly. Some sources state that the feet would be lit first. The person is tied to a stake, and the event happens in an imperial garden where Nero and his friends can spectate. Some years later, Tacitus describes some of the executions like this. Those who confessed were first to be caught, then those who were accused by informers. Those sentenced to death were also mocked. They were torn to pieces by dogs after being disguised as wild beasts, or they were crucified and set on fire at the end of the day as torches to illuminate the night. The same account tells us that Nero put on these light shows for people as he walked around the party dressed as a charioteer. We are led to believe that this spectacle was not for the public good, but for his own sick entertainment. We might never know who started the fire or who was killed for it, or even if Nero did use people as torches. There's a painting that depicts the event that was called in English Nero's Torches, although that wasn't painted until 1876. Can you imagine the conversation between 2 gladiators in the morning before they fight in front of thousands of bloodthirsty spectators? It might have gone something like this. Hey, so what do you got going on today, Carpophories? I was signed up for the new Venatiores, so I'll just be fighting a wild, vicious beast from the other side of the world. What about you, Priscus? I'll be fighting a guy for my freedom today. Nice, good luck with that. By the way, who are you fighting? Versus. Ouch, he's a good guy, that Versus. Yeah, it is what it is. We're not sure it would have happened just like that, but we're probably pretty close. Now let's go a bit deeper into the life of gladiators in ancient Rome. It's thought that the first gladiator schools came about around 100 BC. They were known as Ludi Gladiatorium. Inside those places were the Familia Gladiatorium, a kind of family of gladiators, and you had a person known as the lanista. His function was to not only train the gladiators, but to buy and sell them as well, since most gladiators were seen as property at the time. He was the boss, and if his gladiators performed well, he could make some good money. Some gladiators had been prisoners of war and were usually referred to as noxai. They were not really considered great fighters, and oftentimes their role in the arena was only to have their blood spilled. Then you had the damnati, and these were mainly slaves. They could grow into formidable gladiators. You also had people who were born free and just wanted to go to gladiator school for a chance to earn money and fame, while yet others went because of the debts they owed. While there's evidence of gladiators stretching back long before the 1st century BC, that's when it's thought that the events really got going. Gladiator fights in amphitheaters were big business, and even the events themselves were often used to drum up support for a person in politics. You might have heard of the term bread in circuses, which is used in the context of elite groups using entertainment to blind the masses from such things as corruption and inequality. If the masses had their bloodlust satiated on the weekends, they might not complain so much, or at least that was the idea. To see how these gladiators lived, we can look at what was considered the greatest gladiator school. The Ludus Magnus was situated in Rome, and it was where the best gladiators would want to end up. So what really went down there? First of all, after a man was selected to become a gladiator, he was looked at by the lanista and a medici, or doctor. They would be looking to see if this man could hack it as a trained fighter. He might look tough, but he certainly would need much more training. New recruits were called novitius. There were lots of different types of gladiator, too many for us to talk about them all in detail. Some might fight with different weapons such as spears or swords, or might wear different types of armor. Some might be the net men, and others might specialize in fighting animals. You also had different types of men who had just signed up, such as those gladiators who went to school to pay off debts. These were called aucturati. Then there were the criminals sentenced to death, and those were called noxi, just like prisoners of war. So not all gladiators were alike, and they were treated accordingly throughout their training. Whatever the case, all gladiators swore an oath to perform as they had been told to. This oath was called the Sacramentum Gladiatorium. They basically signed a form that said if they didn't perform well, they agreed to be beaten or burned or killed by the sword. The Romans wanted a spectacle to amuse the crowds, not men who hid in the corner of an arena hoping a bear wouldn't notice him. The novices would go through some initial training, and after that they would be trained for their first fight. These guys were known as tirones gladiators, or sometimes just tiros. If they survived that first fight, then they were veterans and were part of the veterani. During their training, they never used weapons that might cause too much damage, and they weren't supposed to hurt each other too much. Gladiators lived in small cells, and while they were often shackled when they weren't training, they were actually looked after quite well, at least when compared to the lives of many other prisoners or slaves at the time. This wasn't because their owners had hearts of gold, but because they were valuable commodities. If you wanted your gladiators to win, they had to be well fed, well rested, and they had to have their health checked regularly. They would be given water throughout the day to prevent dehydration, but would also be given 3 square meals a day. These meals would include meat, fish, vegetables, cheese, milk, fruits, and cereal, a diet that was much better and more varied than that of many poorer Romans. In light of this, it's not surprising that some free men whose lives were not going all that well signed up to be gladiators. If they won, they not only earned decent cash that gave them a much better standard of living than most poor Romans, but the level of fame they could achieve made them almost like a kind of pop idol or sports star of the day. They just had to keep surviving. On top of that, they could take hot and cold baths, and when their muscles ached, they received massages. Their daily routine wasn't that much different from a modern MMA fighter, although they did have the downside of the loss of their freedom and the prospect of fighting a hungry tiger. On occasion, women would sometimes be provided to these men, prostitution being a regular part of Roman life, while free gladiators could marry and even have their own slaves. The best meal a gladiator would get was the last meal before a fight. It might be the last thing they ever ate, so it was always quite the ritual. Even those condemned to certain death, the noxai, got this meal. Before each fight, the combatants would also take care of their final affairs and say goodbye to loved ones. When the time for the games came, the events were marketed Roman style to get people's attention. The event details were posted on billboards explaining who was fighting. The posters would also detail if any special animals were going to perform and who might be fighting one-on-one. Paired fighters were called ordinari. Posters would also state what music would be played, what food would be on offer, and if anyone was going to be executed that day. For most Romans, it was seen as a sporting event, not an inhumane bloodbath as we might think of it today. There were also, of course, different ways of putting on events. The games took place over hundreds of years, and the arenas were spread far and wide. Nonetheless, usually the games would start with a procession marching into the arena, much like you'd see at a big sporting event today. VIPs would follow and civil servants would walk in with them. They'd have documents that stated the power the magistrate had to take and give life, while images of gods were paraded around to further acknowledge that the event was in some way divine. The last people to enter the arena would be the gladiators, now full on their last meal and ready to fight. The first fights would usually involve animals, and those that fought them were called the bestiari. Those condemned to death might come next, who could be facing their fate in a variety of different ways. Sometimes death would even come by way of a very large beast just sitting on someone. The Romans also liked to kill people by doing reenactments of certain myths or famous battles, in which the condemned played the victims. The last event would usually be gladiator combat, although sometimes before that the fighters might put on a warm-up routine in front of the crowd, using wooden weapons and not ones that could kill. Gladiators could be fighting with any number of weapons, and those were chosen beforehand. There could be as many as 13 fights in one day, and each fight might take up to 20 minutes or more to finish. Like modern combat sports, the main event would be two top-class fighters. This is the event people wanted to see. There would be referees, and the rules of combat had to be adhered to, and the gladiators had to show no fear. But not all of these matches were fought to the death. If an opponent was overcome but not dead, that might be the end of the match. Some gladiators would show mercy, or they'd look to the crowd or the local magistrate and ask them what he should do. A gladiator who knew he was defeated might raise his finger and the ref could stop the fight. But if the crowd wished him dead, then he might be killed anyway. In fact, many matches ended with the loser surviving, but some matches were billed as sine missione, which meant no mercy could be given. The fight had to end with someone dying. These matches that didn't allow mercy were eventually banned. The crowd liked certain gladiators, and it annoyed them if their favorite fighter was killed. Imagine watching your favorite team play in a championship game, lose, and get killed right after. It might take some of the fun out of it. Some bloodthirsty emperors became less popular with the people when they didn't show mercy. So as time went on, it became the standard that both gladiators would survive if they had fought well. When the time to die came, though, it was expected that gladiators would die a good death, that they accept their fate and not scream or cower. One Roman historian wrote this on the topic: "For death, when it stands near us, gives even to inexperienced men the courage not to seek to avoid the inevitable." So the gladiator, no matter how faint-hearted he has been throughout the fight, offers his throat to his opponent and directs the wavering blade to the vital spot. They even had a kind of fight of the night bonus. In that, a great performance could get the gladiator extra money or gifts. In the case of gladiator slaves, they might also earn their freedom. There was a famous fighter named Flamma who is said to have fought in 34 bouts and won most of them. When he lost, he wasn't killed because he was a crowd favorite. He was offered his freedom on 4 different occasions and he turned it down each time. It seems he liked the gladiator lifestyle. It's said that most gladiators, no matter how good they were, would not normally survive more than 10 matches. You have some exceptional gladiators who fought more than 10 times, such as the great Marcus Attilius. He beat some other great warriors too. He was a free man who just wanted to go to gladiator school. Life expectancy of gladiators has been argued over by various historians, but needless to say, many died before they reached 25. Perhaps the lowest life expectancy involved the people who fought wild animals because, hey, what chance did a human have against a lion or a bear that had entered the arena half-starving? Some of those condemned to death by animals were not even given weapons, while others were gladiators trained with weapons who specialized in tackling wild beasts. One such man was named Carpophorus, and he was one of the best-known bestiarios. He was sometimes called King of the Beasts. Like any bestiarios, he would train the animals himself, and so he would be around when a condemned man was to be squashed or ripped apart in front of a cheering crowd. Carpophorus also fought his animals in the arena, and he did all right. It's written that in one fight, a lion, a bear, and a leopard were pitted against him at the same time, and it was the triad of the beasts that lost the fight. It's said in another he beat 20 animals. It's also written that he was so good with animals, he could command certain beasts to do unthinkable things to men during their execution. So maybe when they fought him, he just had too much power over them. There were even some powerful elite people that wanted to be gladiators, but if they weren't fighting against wooden weapons, they usually fought battles they couldn't lose. The spoiled Emperor Commodus was known for his unfair fights, and we can't really include these people when talking about real gladiators. Slaves in ancient Rome weren't all laborers working hard under the hot sun, as some wicked slave driver stood behind them with a whip in his hand. Many of the slaves were domestic servants, some were skilled artisans, others were even said to be highly educated physicians. The ones who did generally have a very hard life were those that were doing their time as property of a Roman as punishment. Life for these people was brutal and often very short. For that reason, there were sometimes slave revolts, with the one you all probably know about led by the slave Spartacus. This former gladiator and military leader took part in what are now called the Servile Wars. But what about the average Joe slaves? So, as Roman slaves lived such diverse lives, let's start with the great Spartacus. The Greek writer Plutarch tells us that Spartacus was a Thracian by birth, who had once served as a soldier with the Romans, but had since been a prisoner and sold for a gladiator. If he indeed was Thracian, then that would mean he came from what we now call Bulgaria, or possibly Greece or Turkey. While sources differ, it's said that Spartacus was first captured by Roman legions and then trained in gladiatorial school. If you've seen our show on what sometimes went down in the Roman Colosseum, you'll know that gladiators didn't exactly have an easy life. What do we know about the schools? Well, these prisoners of war were kept often two to a cell. They were in fact in prison, but each day they would train outside of their cells in an arena. Gladiators had different kinds of skills and training methods, and Thracian gladiators practiced in the art of swordsmanship. National Geographic tells us that the slaves were not allowed out of the fortress unless being taken to the Colosseum or another arena. But while the cells were not exactly a great place to live, it's said that there were heated floors for winter, baths, and an infirmary, and the slaves lived in confines that were equipped with plumbing. Historians say these gladiators were highly valued slaves, and so they were kept in good condition so they could fight well. These slaves, we were told, usually would not die or even be treated too badly in their prison. They occupied a 32 square foot cell, which, as we said, was probably shared with one more person. They trained day in and day out all year round, and trained not as a team but as individuals. When the time came, they were often taken out of the training school and sent to fight in an arena somewhere. So the life of a gladiator slave? Probably a much better existence than hard labor, but obviously they could find themselves in a very bad place being pitted against a starving lion. That's likely one of the reasons why Spartacus decided to plot against the Romans and head for the hills. It's believed he was captured and killed, with many of his followers also dying by way of crucifixion. But perhaps a fate worse than being trained to fight in an arena was hard labor. After all, someone had to build those great cities in the ancient empire, mine the precious metals, and plow the fields. We're told quite often these people would literally be worked to death. When these people were captured, often by Roman soldiers, they were often taken to the market where they were sold. Anyone could buy himself or herself a slave, and it's said some more wealthy people might own as many as 400 slaves. Perhaps the worst kind of work was in the Roman mines, although historians also say that slave farmers had a very hard job. Women slaves with less muscle might work in the house as servants, but they might also be given the job of dressmaking or even hairdresser. Many other women were sent to work in small factories where they would make handcrafts and jewelry. The young boys, it's said, were expensive, as it's not likely many Romans wanted old men in their employ. We say employ, but they weren't paid anything. They had to do exactly as they were told, and any kind of backchat could lead to a serious beating. If a slave killed his own master, that would usually end in all the slaves of the household being killed. One might have a nice master, but the opposite was of course possible. As we said before, some slaves gained a certain amount of respect as they were educated. These slaves would often be appointed to the work of teacher for the young Romans. As one writer tells us, how a slave was treated depended on the owner. If a slave was favored by his owner, there was always a chance that this slave could earn his freedom, perhaps the best thing that could happen to a Roman slave. On the other hand, get an awful owner and there was every chance you could be beaten, flogged, branded, maimed, or killed. One historian writes about the slaves of Pompeii, stating that the average household in the city would have around 7 slaves. He wrote that the work of slaves could be tough, but they were often free to roam about the streets, grab a bit of rest down at the fountain, or just disappear in the crowd. The richer Romans didn't usually walk through the crowded streets, as that would be beneath them. Instead, when they went out, they were carried by slaves on what's called a litter. They are those boxes on sticks you may have seen in the movies. What's surprising though, according to this historian anyway, is that the slaves were not always identifiable by the clothes they wore. They often wore tunics just like anyone else. Apparently, not so many slave owners would wear togas as they were too cumbersome and not always easy to clean. As for cleaning, we're told that clothes would often be washed partly with urine. The reason was that it contained lots of ammonia. One of the jobs of a slave, of course, was washing these clothes, so part of their day would be standing in baths of urine. This was likely not the most pleasant job in the world, but laundry detergent was a long way from being invented. As these slaves were property, if they were damaged in some way, say hit by someone's donkey on their way to cleaning duties, the owner of that donkey would have to pay for the treatment of the slave, or at least pay some money to the slave's owner. Here, we must remember that around 1 out of 5 people across the Roman Empire were slaves at one point, and there was no great feeling of injustice, at least to the Romans. Having slaves was as normal as having people that work for low wages in current-day factories or coffee shops. For the rulers of Rome, the inequality was just part of life. We might also remember that those great Greek philosophers who, for the most part, were noble and extremely clever, said that a perfect society had to have slaves. That's just how it was, and it's likely that Plato or Aristotle just couldn't see it any differently. Remember, in the Roman Empire, the slaves were often the losers of a battle, or at least the surviving citizens of a losing army. The Romans just saw it as their right to take them, but slaves often came by way of piracy or just plain stealing. Gangs of people would go into a town and just take people there, then deliver them by boats or over land to the markets where the Romans would buy them. If those slaves had children with a Roman, those children would also be slaves. One historian tells us that slaves were not allowed to have their own slave families. Life was work, and that was it. The more slaves a Roman had was part of his status, and if you had very special slaves being able to do special things, then that also added to your status. When in public, Roman would often come out with their slaves, showing them off to other Romans. These days, people use things like cars, clothes, bling to do the same thing. And that's what we have to remember, that slaves were seen as mere things, albeit things that could talk. But again, some slaves, the very special ones, did teach things such as philosophy, so we would imagine those slaves had a higher value than someone who spent all day down in a mine digging for gold. We very much doubt that they spent all day chained, like some of the slaves that were found after Mount Vesuvius erupted in Pompeii. Researchers also said that some of those slaves had been working so much that their bodies were all out of shape. As we said, the best thing that could happen to you is that you could win your freedom, and this did happen. Some Romans used it to make slaves work harder, telling them obedience could pay off. Some historians also tell us that in spite of the occasional slave revolts, it was in the interest of slave owners to treat their slaves well, and so many did. A well-fed slave worked harder and was happier, and would likely not dream all day about sinking a knife into his or her owner. We'll leave you with the words of one writer. No doubt some slave owners were more generous than others, and there was, in a few cases, the possibility of earning one's freedom, but the harsh day-to-day reality of the vast majority of Roman slaves was certainly an unenviable one. The year is 117 CE, and the Roman Empire under Emperor Trajan is at the height of its economic, political, and military power. The mighty civilization would hold strong for another several hundred years before finally collapsing, in part because nobody could defeat the empire's legionnaires, a well-trained, well-equipped, and rightly feared fighting force. While very few of the empire's contemporaries could stand against these soldiers, what if we introduced a more interesting challenger into the mix? An M1 Abrams tank, commonly used by the modern armies of the United States, Iraq, Kuwait, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, transported back to ancient times. That's right, the Roman Empire had plenty of iconic enemies, from the brutal Attila the Hun to the elephant-riding Hannibal of Carthage, but few could pose a real threat to the empire's dominance. So it's perhaps worth asking if any of these enemies had even one operational M1 Abrams. Would the sum of Rome's legionnaires be able to stand against them? Would the armored soldiers of the Roman legion go weak at the knees at the approach of an M1's rumbling caterpillar tracks? Or would they stand their ground and use their advanced military tactics to win the day against their more physically powerful foe? It's an epic battle between some of the grandfathers of military innovation and one of the 20th and 21st century's most deadly and enduring pieces of hardcore military hardware, employed everywhere from the Persian Gulf War to the modern skirmishes in the Middle East. As in any battle between two legendary forces, we need to first pick their battleground. Thankfully, this is an area where the Roman Empire and the M1 Abrams quite literally have common ground. As we just mentioned, the M1 Abrams cut its teeth in the Persian Gulf Wars, otherwise known as Operation Desert Storm in Iraq. Well over 1,000 years earlier, the Roman Empire was fighting against the Sasanian Empire in the latter half of the Roman-Persia Wars, in what would now be known as the neighboring country of Iran. So the Middle East is where the game is set for this clash of military titans. In terms of strategic terrain, Iran and Iraq are famous for their rugged mountainous environment. a battleground bound to be treacherous for any force that isn't adequately prepared. Hence why guerrilla forces with prior knowledge of an area have always historically had a home team tactical advantage. It's important to remember that largely thanks to improvements in both communication technology and weaponry, modern warfare moves a lot faster than the conflicts of old. The Gulf War didn't last a full year, and the Middle Eastern conflicts with the US that followed haven't lasted 30. Compare and contrast this to the Roman-Persian Wars, which lasted in total 681 years. With the Middle East being a fair battleground between our two combatants, we now need to look at the combatants themselves. Who exactly are we dealing with here? What are their skills, the loadout, and do either of them have any little tricks up their sleeves? First, let's take a look at your standard Roman legionary. We're not talking about a gang of reckless, greedy sellswords here, nor are we discussing a terrified gang of teenagers drafted into service by an oppressive ruler. Roman legionnaires were volunteer troops, half from Rome proper and half from other territories in the empire, referred to as the auxilia. These soldiers are highly trained, highly organized, and highly motivated, both by a sense of national and military pride, or in the auxilia's case, the opportunity to be rewarded with full-blown Roman citizenship, and the status and wealth that came with being a highly regarded member of the empire's heavy infantry. The Roman Empire was actually more progressive than many of today's world powers in the monetary bonuses they offered to their soldiers as motivation for their service. And of course, while being well motivated and having a good payment plan won't necessarily give our Roman underdogs the edge over an M1 Abrams tank, it certainly won't hurt their chances either. Soldiers that actually want to fight tend to fight better than conscripted armies. Now we know the Roman legionnaires were highly trained and revered infantrymen, but what about their actual equipment loadout? Well, in terms of armor, your standard Roman legionary would typically be fit with a chainmail underlayer, topped either by shoulder pads or in more extreme cases the army's trademark lorica segmentata. This is the term for the steel strips folded into light but powerful body armor, the appearance of which is actually pretty synonymous with the mental image of a Roman soldier, from Gladiator to Monty Python. They also wore helmets that covered their entire head, brow, and neck, leaving only the face exposed. Down below they kept it pretty simple with a leather belt and hobnailed sandals. Another iconic element of the Roman legionary armor is the scutum, a huge curved rectangular shield formed of densely packed layers of plywood, allowing the legionary to not only shield their entire body, but to form complex shield structures with their fellow legionnaires, though we'll delve more into that later. Equally important as the defense is the Roman legionaries' capacity for offense. That's right, we're talking weapons. What kind of weapons did these legends of the military world wield, and would they hold any water against the M1 Abrams tank? For warriors so feared, the Roman legionnaires kept things pretty minimalist in their weaponry. Each legionary carried two javelins known as pilums, designed with an armor-piercing pyramidal head on the end of a long metal shaft. Legionnaires would be trained to throw these javelins with devastating accuracy before charging into battle whatever's left at close range. This they do with the help of their gladius, a short sword designed for stabbing rather than hacking or slashing. As a last resort, the standard legionary is typically packing a pugio, a stout dagger designed once again for stabbing. Considering that most of the Roman army's offensive potential is based around stabbing, how would they fare against an enemy that could not be stabbed, such as an M1 Abrams tank? We've seen what the Roman legionnaires are capable of. Now let's take a look at the M1 Abrams, also known as the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank. This piece of terrifying hardware has been a mainstay of the US ground force since the 90s. Operated by a crew of 4, this tank is capable of moving at max speeds of 42 miles per hour or 69 kilometers per hour thanks to its 1500 horsepower gas turbine engine, almost double the speed of the fastest human ever measured. Considering the Roman legionnaires are literally foot soldiers, being massively outpaced by a far stronger foe definitely isn't a good sign. But things will get worse for our plucky legionnaires. When you consider the Abrams armor, weighing 68 tons, the tank boasts thick metal armor designed to withstand improvised explosive devices, rocket-propelled grenades, and enemy tank fire. The latest iteration is also fitted with M250 6-barreled smoke grenade dischargers, allowing it to create a blinding smoke screen around itself at a moment's notice. A thrown pilum is likely to inflict the same damage as flicking a toothpick at it, much to the frustration of the unfortunate Roman legionnaires. And don't even think about going at it with a gladius unless you like the idea of being crushed. Well, that finally brings us to the weaponry you can expect from a modern M1 Abrams, namely a devastating cannon and 2 different but equally dangerous machine guns. There's the M256 120mm smoothbore cannon, capable of firing M829A4 advanced kinetic energy and advanced multi-purpose purpose or amp rounds that would likely turn a gang of even the toughest legionnaires into a fine red mist. The two secondary weapons are the 12.7mm machine gun and the 7.62mm M240 machine gun, both of which could dish out a devastating level of damage to combatants without modern ballistic armor like the legionnaires. It seems like an almost depressingly one-sided battle. In theory, couldn't a single one of these high-tech death machines mow their way through the entire Roman Empire? Well, on a one-on-one basis, definitely, but the story is never that simple. Two key factors in this battle are numerical advantages and battle tactics. A Roman legion is formed of an impressive 5,000 troops divided into cohorts of 480, each of which is then divided into centuries of 80 to 100 troops. Much like modern infantries, this allows for not only a large overall force, but a great degree of independence between them, and that allows for impressive tactical versatility. An M1 Abrams is a devastating piece of military technology, but it can only fight one battle at a time, and its greatest defensive weapons, the smoothbore cannon and its two machine guns, have finite ammunition. Any method of defeating the M1 Abrams tank would likely lean on this vast numerical superiority, with the ability to act independently and draw the tank's attention as necessary. The problem with many of the Roman legion's most well-known tactics is that they simply weren't designed with a combatant like a tank in mind. Take, for example, the testudo, or tortoise formation, wherein the legion converges and interlocks their shields to deflect projectiles as they move toward their targets. While this would have worked fine for spears and arrows and other non-explosive hand-thrown projectiles, the plywood scutums wouldn't offer much protection against a hail of bullets or the blast of the tank's cannon, or even just the crushing weight of the tank's tracks. The same can be said for other traditional tactics, like the triple line and wedge formation. Tanks are a piece of technology so immune to conventional weapons that a whole new class of anti-tank weaponry had to be built to deal with them. However, there is one feather in the Roman legion's cap: long-term endurance. In addition to their weaponry and armor, each legionary would carry a pila muralia, a forked pole carrying miscellaneous supplies including up to 14 days of rations, a wicker basket, a saw, a length of leather, a shovel, a sickle, and a water skin. Legionnaires would also carry a pickaxe around their belt. These supplies would not only allow the legionnaires to survive on the battlefield for 2 weeks, but would also give them the tools to live longer off the natural resources presented to them by the land around them. It's worth remembering that this particular showdown is happening in the mountainous terrain of the Middle East, where adaptable guerrilla-style forces have always had an advantage. The 5,000-man legion could split into small and maneuverable centuries, allowing it to wage a stealthy and covert war of attrition on the M1 Abrams from the hills, making occasional tactical sacrifices, but preserving the majority of their forces. For highly trained soldiers up against a noisy and large tank, remaining alert and hidden shouldn't be that challenging a task. An interesting fact worth remembering about the M1 Abrams tank is that, much like the ammo supplies that power its dangerous weaponry, the very fuel that allows the tank to move is equally finite. The tank's engine has great mileage by all accounts, but ultimately can only really last for 265 miles before needing to refuel. And while the M1 is actually extremely versatile in its fuel it can utilize, including gasoline, diesel fuel, and jet fuel, you're highly unlikely to find any of these lying around on the battlefields of ancient Iran or Iraq. And here, the Roman legion has its perfect advantage, because even if the tank did potentially have reserves of fuel and ammunition elsewhere, the tank would be seriously vulnerable while replenishing their supplies. If the legionnaires could keep their centuries spread out and mobile around the battlefield, considering their vast numerical advantage of 5,000 to 1, they could deplete the tank's ammunition and fuel until all that was left was a stationary metal hut. At that point, it becomes a type of battle that the ancient warriors are more familiar with: siege warfare. The Roman legion would simply camp out around the now immobilized tank, possibly even digging trenches around it with their shovels in order to further prevent its escape, until the 4 operators of said tank ran out of supplies like food and water. Then they'd have only 2 choices: go out fighting against a numerically superior force of highly trained melee combatants, or surrender to the Roman forces and be captured. Either way, in spite of having inferior weapons and armor in pretty much every regard, this is how a Roman legion, through leveraging its numerical superiority and tactical flexibility, could defeat an M1 Abrams tank. The question of what these legionnaires will do with their newly captured M1 Abrams tank is probably a discussion for another video. It's been a terrible day for young Bibulus Flaccus. He just lost all his money at dice after a few too many glasses of the lowest grade posca. He got the shock of his life in the dirty, stinking public toilet. As he relieved himself, a disease-carrying rat bit his backside, and to his astonishment, flames came up through the hole. And if that wasn't bad enough, in a few weeks' time he's going to have to fight as a gladiator to try to pay off his debts. Bibulus Flaccus didn't have it easy, but as you'll see today, many Romans didn't. That's why we doubt you modern-day folks would have lasted long in the empire. Mr. Flaccus is a guy we just made up, but his crappy day is based on a true story. For instance, Polska was a really cheap alcoholic drink made from water, vinegar, herbs, and salt. Booze reserved for the lowest of the low. A poor Roman could have lost a lot of money after downing a jug of that and playing the popular betting game of dice. He might have also thought about trying to pay off his debts by fighting in the gladiatorial arena. We also mentioned him emptying his bowels in a rather dangerous and disgusting toilet. So we think we'll talk a bit more about hygiene, or lack thereof, in the Roman Empire before we get to the business of fighting for your life and trying to make it through the terrifying ordeal of Roman childhood. The Romans were pretty advanced in terms of sanitation, but that didn't mean there weren't widespread diseases and pervasive filth. Going to the toilet could be a scary thing indeed, which is why some historians say on the walls of public latrines there was often graffiti relating to Fortuna, the goddess of luck, and when you did dump your load, there wasn't that much privacy. The wealthier Romans had private bathrooms with plumbing, so what they dispelled from their bodies went down the hole into a sewer system. For them, the very thought of using a dirty public toilet made them want to throw up. In today's show, we're going to class you as a regular working person in Rome, a plebeian, someone who didn't have an ensuite. In the house, you might have done the deed in a chamber pot and taken the contents out to the sewer, but many regular people just went down to the public toilets where they'd have to likely sit above a hole with many other folks next to them also taking a poop. Their togas might have hidden their private parts, but nothing could hide the noise and the smell. Then there were the rats, which festered around the latrines. They spread disease, and if that wasn't bad enough, sometimes the buildup of methane could cause fires. So this was why many Romans prayed when they dropped the kids off at the pool. According to the book Death and Disease in Ancient Rome, matters were made worse because some people would just throw the contents of their chamber pot into the streets. This exacerbated the already big problem of disease. Even worse, the sick would bathe in public baths with the healthy, so getting ill in Rome wasn't hard to do. They might have used a scraper to remove the dirt when they bathed and also applied some scented olive oils, but they didn't have soap. This also made it easier to spread disease. One good thing they did do, though, was not touch their own poop. To wipe their butts, they often used a sea sponge attached to a stick that was left close to the toilets in a little man-made stream. These things, called tersorium, were shared by everyone. Yuck. The Roman Empire lasted over 1,000 years, and of course some places were filthier than others, but in general, if we sent you back there now, the majority of you would have an issue with pooping and bathing. Even the Roman elites would have been extremely desperate to use the bog, as the British call it. Free women in general never used the public toilets, and even if a slave girl did have to relieve herself in them, she ran the risk of being mugged or assaulted. This brings us to crime. We very rarely hear about the streets of ancient Rome, where the regular people lived and worked. These streets were not a place you wanted to be after dark. If you lived in a city, there were slums, and even if you didn't live in an ancient Roman project, you might have been housed with other families in a rather packed ancient-style apartment complex. We know a little bit about these areas thanks to the Roman poet named Juvenal, who didn't have many nice things to say about the poorer parts of Rome. He joked about walking through the dark streets at night, saying that one of the many hazards was someone throwing a chamber pot full of human detritus out from a window and it landing on your head. In his own words, he said, "There's death in every open window as you pass along at night. You may well be deemed a fool, improvident of sudden accident, if you go out to dinner without having made your will." Many poor people lived in the little rooms contained in large buildings called insula, meaning island. They were sometimes 100 feet high, so it wasn't much fun walking under those at night. One guy that lived in one of those buildings wrote that they were so close together he could lean out of his window and shake hands with the guy in the next building. Generally, the less cash you had, the higher up you lived because of the dangers up at the top. People in those buildings weren't exactly secure. If a fire happened, that often meant mass death. The Roman statesman Cicero once joked, "2 of my buildings have fallen down and the rest have large cracks. Not only the tenants, but even the mice have moved out." It was no joke for the tenants, of course. There were lots of overpopulated, crumbling buildings, and since the residents cooked in little metal boxes in their rooms, there were a lot of deadly building fires. If things did go up in flames, though, everything you had was gone. The poor couldn't afford insurance. That was a luxury reserved for the rich. One modern historian wrote about what happened to the poor in the event of a fire. You were on your own. At best, you might hope for help from friends or relatives or perhaps a wealthy patron. He said there was no form of banking for these people, meaning when things turned disastrous, they were truly fudged. And in those dark labyrinths of streets, there was more to fear than falling poop and dodgy safety standards. A rich person would not travel through the streets at night, and if they really had to, you can be sure they'd have what Juvenal called a long retinue of attendants. That's because there were so many muggers lurking in the dark. This also meant that the average person would have to worry about more than just muggers. Sometimes the rich would walk around the streets and they'd have their armed escort beat the crap out of you just for fun, or especially if you'd gotten in their way. The historian Suetonius wrote that Emperor Nero would do this while dressed up as a commoner wearing a hat and a wig, and to those that fought back, he'd wound them and throw them in the common sewer. That was actually pretty charitable for the sadistic Nero. There were watchmen called vigils, but they mainly focused on fires. In general, when it came to keeping your valuables or your life, when you went out at night, you took a risk. Nonetheless, there were laws written in the Book of Civil Laws, and if you chose the thug life in ancient Rome, you could end up in court, and the outcome could be brutal. But just remember that forms of justice changed over the centuries. You can find documented cases of when thugs thought they could get away with crime. In one case, a man sneaked into a shop and put out the lamp in order to steal something. The shopkeeper, probably a bit of an ancient Charles Brosnan character, wasn't having any of that, despite seeing that the thief was armed with a piece of rope that had a chunk of metal connected to it. They went for it in the street, and the result was that thief getting a good beating and losing one of his eyes. The case went to court, and it was decided that the man had every right to take that eye. Case closed. But let's say you lived in one of those godforsaken places, and one day you decided to stand up and fight for your rights by protesting a recent tax hike. Tax increases were common. Those military campaigns weren't cheap, and there's evidence of tax increases not just bankrupting regular people, but driving some to starvation. Of course you'd fight. By the way, there were from time to time general strikes in Rome where the plebes were virtually starved. These were called secessio plebis, and sometimes came with the threat of whipping or death. Other times there was actual reform and the elites acceded more power to the people. But let's say you were part of the protest in Rome that turned into a riot that got out of hand. The emperor surrounded himself with his Praetorian Guard, and the regular Roman guards were sent to the streets to break up the crowds and arrest the ringleaders. Even though you aren't a slave, your arrest spells big trouble for you. You see, you're a person of meager wealth, and because your social status isn't high, you will be treated worse by the courts. It's just how things were. As one historian remarked, your chances of success in court would depend largely on your status vis-a-vis the accused. If you were a slave, it would be even grimmer. It would also be bad if you were a non-citizen. But even though you are a citizen, you're part of what's called the humilores, the lower class, not the higher class honestiores. You then get sent to the civil courts and are found guilty of causing violence and inflaming the public's discontent. There were no long-term prisons for criminals in ancient Rome. As historians like to say, justice was swift. Not only that, you could be legally tortured before you confessed. That was fine in the eyes of the state, although this was usually only used for the worst kinds of crimes. In short, since it was a fairly serious violent crime, you'd be lucky to get just a whipping. For the same crime, a non-citizen might have found himself being worked to death on one of the mines or quarries, and that meant worked to death literally. It was a death sentence, and it was slow and agonizing. If during a riot a fire broke out and someone died and you got the blame, you could expect the worst. In ancient Rome, this could be brutal. It might have been a beheading, but depending on who you annoyed, it could have meant being burned, buried alive, thrown off a cliff, crucified, impaled, or even being tied up in a sack with a snake and a rooster and a dog, and then thrown in the river. As a member of the lower classes, you might have also been forced to fight in the arena, damnatio ad gladium ferrum. This really sucked. Gladiators in ancient Rome, as we said at the beginning, could have been volunteers trying to pay off debts. They could have also been slaves or someone who committed a serious crime. In any case, you'd have to look past Hollywood and imagine what it would feel like fighting for your life against another gladiator or even wild animals. And we don't mean rabbits or geese. Damnatio ad gladium was a special kind of fighting because in this case you had zero chance of winning, and we mean zero. It was a sentence of dying by the sword. It was a punishment most often reserved for slaves. But since you're a menace to society, you're getting the chop. The statesman and philosopher Seneca had a particular distaste for this. He wrote that one day he went to the arena expecting to see games, but instead found a bloodbath and death. He said about the condemned, they have nothing with which to protect themselves. Since their whole body is exposed to blows, they never strike fruitless. Similar was damnatio ad bestias, condemned to beasts. Seneca wrote, in the morning they throw humans before the lions and bears. This often happened to the criminal lower classes, especially if they'd committed the crime of kidnapping, counterfeiting, or like you, causing an uprising. Plus, after death, the property of the deceased was taken and no will was allowed to be written. This was hardcore Roman justice at its worst. But sometimes the plebes loved seeing the condemned being slashed to pieces by the claws of a lion, a tiger, a leopard, or a hyena. Taken from North Africa, or a brown bear or a wolf taken from other parts of Europe. Sometimes there wasn't much fighting at all, and the condemned was just crushed by an elephant or fed to a crocodile. It was rough justice for sure, but sometimes criminals were given a chance to fight for their freedom after receiving a good amount of training at a gladiator school. The punishment was known as damnatio ad ludos, meaning condemned to the games. With around 400 amphitheaters all over the empire, there were a lot of games. They were massive events too, sometimes advertised like we advertise movies, but with giant paintings on the walls of gladiators or the exotic animals. Despite what you might have seen, when the professional gladiators fought, it wasn't always a fight to the death. In fact, the mortality rate might have been from 20 to 25% in these highly entertaining exchanges of skill and might. Sometimes a man could fight to live another day and then fight again, and perhaps one time the sponsor of the games would hand him a wooden sword, a rudis, at the end, which meant he got back his freedom. The thumbs down thing was also real. Sometimes an injured fighter would raise a finger as a sign of submission, and a ref would stop the match. Then the editor, sometimes the emperor, would gauge the crowd's feelings and give a thumbs down for death or 2 fingers for mercy. If the injured man had put up an excellent fight, he was often spared in the context of the games, not in the death penalty context where he was always finished off. In that case, even if without a sword or armor he somehow beat the other guy, another gladiator would step in and finish the job. So were the games fixed? That's hard to say for sure, but it would be foolish to suggest they were never fixed over all those years. One time a man in the crowd booed and shouted about a fix, and the Emperor Domitian had him taken to the arena and torn apart by a bunch of hungry wild dogs. It's probably better to keep your suspicions to yourself, something we imagine would be hard for many of you outspoken YouTube commenters. Given the massive incarceration rate in the USA and the fact that 70% of Americans have done something that could land them in prison, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say many of our viewers may have faced this blood sport during the days of the Roman Empire. So yeah, that's another reason why you wouldn't have lasted long back then, or at least if we sent you back now and you didn't change your ways. But what if you got sick in those days? In the latter part of the empire, the Romans did some amazing things in terms of medical discoveries. They had people such as the guy we all call Galen, who made many breakthroughs in medicine. If you were sick, you might have been told to take some rest or exercise more, and if you were lucky enough to see a physician, he might have told you that you had an imbalance of one of the 4 humors. Those were black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. If they were out of balance, the theory was you could get physically sick or mentally depressed. So, if you had constant headaches or chronic stomach pains, the way you'd likely have been treated is by purging the overabundant humor responsible. That could mean bloodletting or forced vomiting. As the encyclopedist Celsus advised, to cause a vomit on getting up in the morning, he should first drink some honey or hyssop in wine, or eat a radish, and after that drink tepid water. In general, if you got seriously sick, there wasn't much you could do but hope your immune system, that no one knew anything about of course, would come to the rescue. As medicine advanced in the empire, there were crude surgeries such as amputations, but there were no anesthetics. Opium was sometimes administered, but it wasn't exactly great at relieving pain for removing bits of people. If you came down with a disease, say a virus, it might have been blamed on minute creatures too small for the naked eye to see. That was pretty close to the truth. But another person might have told you the stars gave you the disease. There were lots of wacky theories about medical treatments back then. If you had warts, you might have been told to apply burned cow dung, mouse poop, or swan fat to the affected area. At some point in time, when you had chronic headaches, you might have been advised to apply a fox's genitals attached to your head. For epilepsy, you might have been told to drink the blood of a gladiator, or eat some camel's brain that's been soaked in vinegar, or consume water that had a bear's genitals in it. You might have also been told that you were possessed by a higher power. You get the picture. Getting sick in Roman times wasn't a walk in the park. As for diet, you won't be surprised to hear that the richer Romans had a much more diverse diet than the poor did, including lots of meat. The very poor might have subsisted by eating lots of porridge called pulse, but most folks get their hands on fruit and vegetables and, of course, that Roman favorite, bread. Those with more money would eat things such as flamingo tongues, or they might have been partial to the delicacy of dormice. It seems they also ate a lot of meat and fish that weren't cooked well, given the fact that researchers say many Romans had a parasite problem. The sharing of butt cleaners also did not help. The wealthy also ate poop, or at least cow dung. They believed that when it was boiled and mixed with vinegar, it could be added to water, and the drink provided a boost of energy. Many collected their own urine for the purpose that when it dissolved into ammonia, it was great at keeping clothes and teeth white. But that was mostly for the well-to-do. Your regular person wouldn't have had time to think about how white their teeth were. They would have been more concerned with getting their next meal. and perhaps feeding their new baby, a baby that in the worst cases would have been dumped in the streets with the hope someone might take it as a slave. Let's also remember that the father and the mother of this baby might well have been in their early teens, and that there was a real chance that the mother might have died while giving birth. Prior to that, she could have been given some powdered pig poop to drink with some water to relieve her labor pain. If the pain got too bad, someone might have placed the right foot of a hyena on her. We have no idea how they came up with that. While these kids were considered adults at that stage, even at age 12, they were supposed to have given up playing with toys and were now expected to do some serious chores. After age 8, kids were seen as being old enough to take on responsibilities. Playtime was over, childhood was tough, but given how hard it was to get through with all the disease you could contract, adulthood was a blessing, especially for the poor. All in all, life was hard for the poor just as it is now, but there were many positive things about ancient Rome. We'll just save them for another day. The Roman military is considered one of the greatest militaries of all time. With an empire that stretched across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, the Roman Empire's strength largely came off its famous legions. But while a good bit of the history books are devoted to the great battles, campaigns, and generals of Rome, not as much focus is put on the individual legionnaires that made up the Roman army. So with that being said, here are 50 insane facts about the Roman legions and the lives they led from their point of view. Number 50. Not anybody could join one of Rome's legions. In order to qualify for military service, prospective recruits had to meet a laundry list of requirements. The first of these was to be an actual Roman citizen. While Roman citizenship was eventually granted to all free men, this was not the case for most of Rome's history. Only full Roman citizens could join. Those of lesser citizenship classes, like those from conquered territories, could join auxiliary units instead. Roman citizens could also join an auxiliary unit if the regular legions were not accepting recruits at the time. Besides being a full Roman citizen, recruits also could not be married. However, that did not stop some unhappily married men from running away from home and joining a legion. Doing so was considered an immediate declaration of divorce. Recruits must also be healthy and come from a favorable trade. Among some of the most desired trades where Roman recruiters sought men were from butchers, blacksmiths, and reapers. This was due to the physical nature of the work that created strong men who were used to working with their hands. Speaking of hands, recruits must also have all their fingers and thumbs to qualify for service. While this might be overlooked during times of emergency, not having one index finger or thumb would be grounds for denial. The reason for this is that it's much harder to grip a sword and shield without them, so the man could be a liability for those around him. Lastly, prospective legionnaires also needed a full set of male genitalia. Eunuchs, males who had their testicles purposefully severed as a child, and women need not apply. However, due to problems with recruiting, the regulations eventually relaxed to allow men who possessed just one testicle to join. Number 49. Legionnaires were pretty tall for the time. To be considered fit for military service, prospective recruits needed to be at least 5 feet 10 inches in Roman feet. A Roman foot is about a third of an inch shorter than a US customary foot. So that means unless you were 5'8" by today's standards, the legions were closed to you, unless you were a very stocky individual. Number 48. Rome's legions did not want hardcore criminals. Those who may have had a life of petty crime before could find a new life and fresh start in the legion. However, those wanting to escape persecution for a serious crime or to return from exile could not sign up. Those who tried to do so would not only be rejected but turned over to the proper authorities for prosecution. However, Roman officers did not have the luxury of different background checks available to us today. So how did they figure out a recruit's character? Number 47. Along with the previously mentioned requirements to join the Legion, one of the last hurdles to pass is a recruit needing at least one letter of recommendation attesting to their character and future abilities as a soldier. Not surprisingly, letters that came from veteran soldiers carried the most weight. For a little icing on top, getting a letter from someone who had served in the Legion you wanted to join was considered the best way to get accepted. Number 46. Before recruits could be inducted, they had to pass one last test, known as the probatio. This was an interview with legionary officers after recruiting officers screened the candidate. If accepted, the recruit took the military oath immediately and became a soldier of Rome. Number 45. After having taken the military oath, one of the first tasks as a soldier was to report to their cohort commander's tent to have detailed information written down about them on the unit's muster rolls. Besides each man's name, information like his height, age, hair color, eye color, scars, marks, tattoos, and any other identifying features were recorded. Such information would prove useful later on in case they had to recover his body from a pile of corpses on the battlefield, or if he was arrested on suspicion of desertion if caught away from his unit. Number 44. If a man was recruited far away from his legion, the Roman army would pay an often substantial amount of money for the recruit to arrive at their base. If multiple men were recruited at once, the recruiting officer or cohort commander might take their money and pay for transportation to the new home. Once they arrived, the remainder would be split and deposited into their accounts. Those who travel alone might have to rough it out and have a nice little nest egg to start off their military career. Number 43. Once arriving at his base, the recruit must then learn the basics of a legion structure. During most of the Republican period, the legion was divided into 10 maniples, with around 120 men split into 3 ranks in each maniple. During the late Republican period and the Imperial period, as the legions grew in size, Roman legions consisted of 10 cohorts of around 480 men each. Each cohort was further divided into 4 maniples of 120 men each. Each maniple had 2 centuries, each century was led by a centurion, and had about 60 men in each one. With these numbers, the total strength of a fully manned legion was around 6,000 personnel. But if you were doing the math, this would mean that only about 4,800 men were accounted for, so who made up the rest? Number 42. To reach the ideal number of 6,000, the first cohort was always an overstrength cohort of 800 men. The remainder of the balance was made up of support troops like cooks and blacksmiths. However, most Roman legions were chronically undermanned and struggled to maintain this 4,800 figure at any given time. Number 41. After induction, new recruits would enlist for 25-year terms. After completion of these enlistments, the veteran soldier could now retire. The process of retirement payments in the form of land or cash began in earnest during the end of the Republican period. To save the Roman treasury money over time, Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, seized land from wealthy individuals or sold grain to pay cash retirement bonuses to soldiers who did not want land. It was not until the year 6 AD that Augustus created the official military treasury, which was funded through his generous donation equivalent to around $500 million in today's currency, along with a variety of taxes. This fund would eventually pay for equipment, salaries, and retirements of Roman soldiers for the next several hundred years. Number 40. Each legion had its own unique identity. Some legions have been around for hundreds of years, while others might only last a few decades. Where a legion was stationed largely dictated its units' customs, traditions, and courtesies. Additionally, legions that were wiped out or surrendered were removed from standard naming conventions. For example, the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were annihilated in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. Rome never used those unit designations ever again. Number 39. Roman legions did not go into battle by themselves. Though movies often portray Roman battles as masses of line infantry, this was not the case. Rome had numerous cavalry units. Those units were open to both citizens and non-citizens alike. Roman citizens used to prefer serving in the cavalry, but by the imperial period, the allure of serving in the cavalry had diminished since their votes did not count more than a legionary's vote in elections as they used to during the early Republican period. Instead, many non-Romans with money joined the cavalry. These units were pretty useful both before, during, and after battle. During the battle, Roman cavalry was used to create diversions or strike an enemy's flank when he was weak. Before the battle, cavalrymen were used as scouts and reported enemy movements. After the battle, these troops moved ahead to cut down fleeing enemies, while legionnaires rested after a hard day of fighting. But cavalry were not the only other troops on the battlefield. Number 38. Auxiliary cohorts often accompanied Roman legions into battle. Auxiliary units were not nearly as structured or regimented as the Roman legion was for a few reasons. Firstly, Roman generals wanted to avoid too many foreigners in their ranks, lest they overwhelmed the legion in a coup. Secondly, auxiliary troops were often raised when needed and could be recruited locally. It was much easier to raise a cohort of several hundred men than several thousand. Auxiliary also had many of the skills that Roman line infantry did not possess. Cavalry, archers, slingers, and scouts are a few of the skills auxiliary troops brought to the battlefield for the legion. Number 37. Roman legions relied on auxiliary troops for local expertise. Though usually posted in one area, it was pretty common in times of emergency or war for entire legions to cross the empire. For example, during the Parthian Wars, several legions were called from Britain and along the Rhine to fight in the Middle East. Auxiliary troops were crucial to gain local knowledge of these areas. These soldiers understood local customs and traditions, could speak local languages, and their methods of warfare were suited to the local area. For instance, keeping Batavian infantry who were excellent swimmers in the Rhine area was a smarter move than transferring them to the deserts of North Africa. Number 36. Beyond providing Roman legions with local expertise, the Roman army integrated them fully into their battle plans. auxiliary units would be expected to scout ahead of the main army. They often conducted most of the foraging duties, as well as briefing Roman commanders on the most likely course of action the enemy would take. As the fight unfolded, auxiliary units often conducted the first preliminary skirmishes to bloody the enemy, kept enemy cavalry off the legion's flanks, pelted the enemy with arrows or slingshot rounds, and held broken ground or hilly areas that were difficult to maintain by legion formations. Lastly, if required, they sometimes stood shoulder to shoulder with legionnaires in the thick of the fighting. Number 35. Roman soldiers had to purchase their own equipment. Before the advent of the military treasury, Roman citizens of poorer backgrounds were limited in the quality of equipment they could buy. However, as the Roman army began foregoing property requirements and looked solely at those who were citizens of the empire and fit enough, the military could pay for a legionnaire's equipment and deduct the costs from his salary. Number 34. The basic equipment of each legionary was tailored for uniformity across the legion. Military sandals with hobnails and tunics could be privately purchased, but the same tailor or shoemaker often supplied a local legion with these pieces of equipment. For example, there was no standard tunic in the Roman army. The color and fabric type varied depending on where the unit was posted. Those in Britain might have a woolen tunic, while those in Syria would probably have lighter linen ones. But what about Roman armor? Number 33. Armor worn by legionnaires fell into two broad types. There was the classic chainmail, which was preferred by the auxiliaries, and scale armor. Scale armor, known as lobster-style armor, was preferred and is often worn by legionnaires in movies and documentaries. The basic lobster-style armor was comprised of a series of steel plates fixed to figure-hugging iron bands attached to a leather frame. Because of this, each legionnaire must be personally fitted for his armor, almost like a suit. Number 32. Roman helmets were designed with survivability in mind. While older bronze helmets of the Republican period might have had colorful plumes and other features meant to distinguish soldiers in battle, by the imperial period, these iron helmets were perfectly designed to provide maximum protection. Made primarily in Gaul, as Roman troops believed the locals there made better helmets than in Italy, the helmet had several distinct features to protect the wearer. The first of these was a strong crossbar above the forehead. The crossbar's intended purpose was to deflect downward blows meant to cleave the Roman soldier's head in half. Along the sides of the wearer's heads were plates that stretched down the soldier's ears and cheeks. These were meant to deflect glancing blows from missile hazards like javelins and arrows. At the back of the helmet, the reverse brow extended back to protect the backside of the soldier's neck. Should he fall down in battle or an enemy get behind him, it would be much more difficult to cleave off his head with this protecting it. Number 31. Roman shields had an equal amount of thought put into them, ensuring they'd maximize survivability. Besides armor, the legionnaire's shield protected against incoming sword blows and spear jabs. The shield's base was created using a combination of 3 different layers of wood. Each layer brought different qualities to the shield, such as birch for flexibility and oak for strength. The layers were carefully glued together, ensuring the wood grain was at right angles to the preceding layer. Wooden beams provide additional support for the shield. With the base made, the outer part of the shield is covered with a metal plate. On top of that metal plate was either a piece of fabric or leather. The painting that went on top of each shield varied from legion to legion, depending on the customs and traditions of that unit. Number 30. Part of the reason why Rome's armies were so dominant was because they possessed superior, standardized swords. Though several variations emerged over the centuries, the most common Roman sword was the gladius. The standard gladius was 18 to 22 inches long and about 2 inches wide. It was made of high-quality steel and was primarily designed to be used as a stabbing weapon. Uniquely for a stabbing sword, the gladius did not have blood grooves that allowed air into wounds. Instead, the sword would get stuck inside a hapless enemy, and only a firm twist and pull could release it for another blow. Combined with being a well-balanced sword and having a tight handle made out of bone or rawhide, the gladius was Rome's short-range killing machine. Number 29. The Roman military created a specially designed handheld weapon to disable enemies during long-range infantry engagements. Known as the pilum, this looked like a normal spear but varied in a ton of ways. The main shaft was made of about 4 feet of wood. A 2.5-foot shaft of soft iron with a triangle tip was attached at the end of the shaft, with the iron shaft being much thinner than the wood shaft of the pilum. Sometimes a lead weight was added near the wood shaft's end. The purpose of the pilum was to be used as an expendable long-range weapon that could not be thrown back at the legions. Once embedded in an enemy shield, the weapon renders it useless until it's pulled out. If a legionnaire missed and hit the ground, the pilum would shatter. or its metal shaft would bend in a way that could not be used again. But if the weapon happened to hit a man, it was more than capable of going through armor and flesh. Number 28. Besides carrying weapons and armor, Roman soldiers also carried a wide variety of tools and other kit for use in the field. One of the most basic of these tools was the Roman pack. Under the reforms of Marius, Roman soldiers were expected to carry a good portion of their personal property. Doing so prevented huge baggage trains that both slowed the legion down and presented a tempting target to raiders. The Roman soldier's pack was a simple 4-foot-long pole with a crossbar. A soldier could hang his pack with a cloak, cooking utensils, shovel, water flask, and rations. Number 27. Despite carrying a good amount of personal kit, the Roman army allowed one pack mule per squad of 8 men to carry things like their tent and other camping equipment. Number 26. Once a unit received a new recruit, he was put through a gradual stage of training by fellow legionnaires. The first of those stages was learning how to march. To start with, a squad of trainees was expected to march 20 miles in 5 hours and 40 miles in 12 hours. Once they could achieve this without wearing any equipment, they donned a complete set of armor and weapons to repeat the tests with a full combat load. Number 25. The first enemy a Roman soldier faced was a wooden post. It's here that new soldiers learn the art of swordplay. Training sessions are almost always held outside in the rain, heat, or snow. Soldiers practice their strikes against the wooden posts, sometimes with their own equipment, but often with wooden swords and shields. These wooden arms are purposefully made to be heavier than their actual equipment to build strength in their troops. Number 24. Roman soldiers used each other for pilum practice. Once new soldiers had learned the basics of swordsmanship, they went on to cover how to throw and receive a pilum. The training pilum was the same length and weight as a regular one, but instead of a long steel shaft, the training one had a soft leather button covering the end. New recruits were taught how to throw the pilum, with the receiving recruit expected to parry it with a shield or sword. Veteran soldiers sometimes took the opportunity to throw the training pilum at new recruits and see just how much they'd learned. Number 23. To increase the agility of each man, every army barracks had a vaulting horse built on the grounds. This fake horse was designed to be leapt over or on with soldiers in full armor or weapons. The vaulting horse increased agility and helped show any loose or pointy parts of a man's armor that needed correcting. Number 22. Besides practicing individual skills, a good part of both the recruits' and veterans' day was formation drills. Because Roman legions built its strength around their ability to move as one in combat, these drills would be carried out routinely on the parade field and open country. Whether it was going from a line to a wedge or falling into a defensive circle, Roman soldiers would practice these skills stationary, and then at a walking pace, and finally at a running pace. They also practiced changing formations, whether walking forwards, backwards, or sideways. Number 21. One of the most brutal methods of punishment for the Roman army was decimation, but it was not a one-size-fits-all punishment. For example, decimation was famously used several times in the Republican period for units that broke off and ran. Every 10th man was either clubbed or beheaded by his fellow soldiers. However, sometimes entire units that fled the battlefield were slaughtered or sent on basically suicide missions to retake enemy ground. Number 20. Though decimation was infamous throughout Roman history, the last recorded decimation occurred in the year 69 AD under Emperor Galba, when he decimated a unit of converted rowers who refused to give up their lives as infantry and return to their ships as rowers. It should be noted that this is the last confirmed decimation, and the martyrdom of the Theban legion in the 3rd century AD is still hotly debated among historians. Number 19. Besides decimation, Roman military officers had a variety of minor punishments they could use for everyday offenses. The most common punishment was the castigato. The castigato was basically getting whacked with a wooden staff carried by a centurion however many times he wanted. There was no set of standard strikes, and according to one story where legionnaires killed their centurions, one was famously nicknamed "Give Me Another," which suggests some centurions would keep hitting their soldiers until they broke multiple staffs. Roman soldiers could also get their pay docked for losing equipment in battle or get assigned unfavorable duties like cleaning the stables or latrines. Number 18. While decimation was the worst punishment of all, several others were just as bad. Militiae mutatio was when a soldier lost his rank or long service privileges, such as no longer being subjected to menial tasks. This could also be implemented on an entire unit. Soldiers who fell asleep on watch during garrison duty or hit an officer could be flogged in front of the entire unit. Those who fell asleep on guard duty during campaigns would be beaten to death by their comrades. Units could also be punished Units that fled in the face of the enemy may be forced to lose their meat and wheat rations. Instead, they were forced to eat barley, which was given as animal fodder, and sometimes forced to pitch their tents outside the safety of the camp's walls until the unit proved itself in battle again. Number 17. Roman enlisted men had a very distinct hierarchy of ranks, each with different rights and privileges. At the very bottom of the totem pole was the munifex. A munifex is the newest recruited soldier who had not passed any training yet. These troops are the lowest of the low and routinely carry out all the tasks no one else wants to do, like cleaning latrines, stables, carrying water, or collecting wood. Once a soldier's been trained enough to earn his place, he is considered an immunis. Most soldiers spend their entire careers at this rank. The soldiers here are divided into two groups: those who know or learn a special skill, such as carpentry, blacksmithing, plumbing, etc., will continue their service by carrying out those special skills. Those who did not learn a trade are still expected to carry out tasks like carrying water and cleaning latrines. Because of this, an immunis must learn a skill he enjoys to avoid backbreaking manual labor. The most desired enlisted position would be the rank of principalis. These positions were few in number and were some of the most vital in the century. For example, there was one position where the legionary carried out the watch rotations, or another who would serve as second in command if the centurion fell in battle. Number 16. Roman officer ranks were also structured based on a strict hierarchy of seniority. Centurions almost exclusively had risen through the ranks. They gained to this position through either merit, bravery, or both. These officers were the workhorses of the legion's leadership, of which there were about 60. Commanding each cohort is a tribune. While not in battle, the next higher officer became the camp prefect. This person was always the most senior centurion who ran the day-to-day operations of the camp. Just above him would be the second in command. The tribunus laticlavus is the most senior tribune, who would assume command if the legate, the legion's leader, cannot, due to death, injury, or recall, perform his duties. Number 15. Because promotion to centurion comes due to merit or bravery, the legion's legate must recommend promotion to this rank from the provincial governor. The emperor himself would then approve each appointment to the centurion. Number 14. For immunis, there were about 20 different roles they could pick from when choosing a job to get them out of menial labor. Number 13. During the era of the Pax Romana, Roman camps were incredibly large and complex structures, covering an area of about 55 acres. These massive complexes were made with 4 rectangular walls, a main road, legion headquarters, a hospital, blockhouses, workshops, and granaries. Number 12. Inside a Roman camp, each century got its own barracks block. Inside the housing block, each contubernium or squad got its own barracks block of about 100 square feet. Inside this block, 8 men shared both a sleeping quarters of about 50 square feet and living quarters of 50 square feet. They could store their things, share meals, and gossip about the day in their living quarters. Number 11. While Roman soldiers could not be married when joining or marry while in the army, their commanders did not mind if they had families or girlfriends in the local area. Soldiers were allowed to leave often for liaisons with local women, and the children produced could become useful to the military later in life. Number 10. Roman soldiers did not spend their entire time living inside the camp. In fact, they actually spent most of their time outside its walls performing other duties. Some examples of responsibilities that would take them outside of the walls would be escorting Roman officials, performing construction work on roads or bridges, guarding villages against raids, performing convoy duty for merchants laden with valuable goods, or being sent to assist another legion currently on campaign. Number 9. To prevent any man from getting singled out for extra duties or standing guard, the daily duties of each soldier were logged down in legion records. Number 8. 3 times per month, the entire legion would leave the camp walls to participate in mock battles. The mock battle would be with a forced march of 10 miles preceded by a cavalry charge. Once the imaginary enemy had been broken, the legion would move forward using different formations, usually uphill for extra exercise. Number 7. If a legionary was not working outside the camp's walls, he was probably standing on sentry duty. Roman soldiers stood a ton of watch, whether at the gates, on the ramparts, in the watchtowers, the granaries, the workshops, or following the camp prefect around. Roman soldiers built their day around when they would have to stand watch the next time. Number 6. Roman soldiers while in garrison ate 2 primary meals. The morning meal usually consisted of cold meat and bread. The evening meal was the more substantial meal of the day and usually consisted of larger portions of meat, cheese, bread, beer, and wine. Pork was the most common meat legionnaires ate, but what was available depended on the local market. All rations given to troops were first inspected by their tribune to ensure local vendors were not bribing Roman soldiers to provide substandard food. Number 5. Despite the amount of daily guard duty, training, manual labor, and out-of-area tasks a Roman soldier might be forced into, there still was significant amount of downtime while in garrison. A famous saying of the day was that a Roman soldier just needed a wash, wine, and a woman. Accordingly, many areas around military camps grew accustomed to this behavior with bars and brothels. However, to combat troops spending their money on such vices, legates and Roman leadership made an effort to provide entertainment that did not involve alcohol or prostitution. Legion commanders often sponsored plays, comedy shows, and mimes to come visit the camps. These commanders could also sponsor Legion wrestling tournaments and other competitions among unit personnel to build camaraderie and let off some steam. Number 4. When Roman armies needed additional manpower for a campaign, the army commander could request from the emperor that vexallations be sent to him to strengthen the army or replace losses. These units were supposed to be detachments of cohorts from garrison units to serve in faraway places. While these cohorts were supposed to be made of the best men available, since they were going to war, oftentimes centurions used this as an opportunity to rid themselves of their troublemakers, sometimes permanently. Number 3. Before an army that had been in garrison for a while left on campaign, the legate would frequently turn the entire command out and force them to sleep in tents for several weeks before marching. Doing so allowed troops to get used to living outside, see what was missing from their supplies, and how to set up a field camp properly before moving out. Number 2. One of the biggest problems for a Roman army while on campaign was not when and where to meet the enemy, but food. Roman legions had extended supply chains to keep their legions fed. However, should these chains get interrupted due to attacks, Roman soldiers carried an average of a week's worth of food on their person. The main diet while on campaign consisted of grain baked into simple cakes or cattle, which followed the legion in its march and would be slaughtered daily. Foraging also was another way of procuring food. In fact, foraging for food was expected to be the main way to supply various food to troops in the field. It's one of the main reasons the Romans preferred to campaign in the summer and fall, so they could send their auxiliary troops to bring back grain, vegetables, sheep, cattle, and pigs to feed their armies. Number 1. Every day while on campaign, the average legion consumed 18,000 pounds of grain, 12,000 gallons of water, and 40,000 pounds of forage for its pack animals. Go to southern France today and you might come across a structure that's nothing but amazing. There, you'll find the 3-tier aqueduct known as the Pont de Guerre. It's one of the best preserved Roman aqueducts anywhere in the world, and also the highest. But what's hard to get your head around is that this magnificent structure was built roughly 2,000 years ago in the 1st century AD. UNESCO has called it a testament to human genius. While no one disagrees that this ancient structure shows us that those Romans, or at least some of them, were exceptionally talented engineers, there are myriad buildings that tell us this, such as the Roman baths in the English town of Bath, or the mighty Pantheon, still both in good condition. The question is, how did they do it, and can we recreate their incredible formula today? Let's first have a look at when the Romans got their hands on concrete. The Romans were masters at making concrete, but they didn't start using some form of concrete until around the 3rd century BC. There's even a period known as the Roman Concrete Revolution, which is when engineers experienced an explosion in their use of very creative building processes and architectural elements thanks to the incredible concrete formula that they could exploit to build much more impressive structures. Without this concrete, we wouldn't have all those amazing structures still standing today. The ancient Romans, of course, didn't call it concrete, but the Latin words opus caementicium. It would be an understatement to say concrete was important to the Romans because it helped build a lot of things they were famous for, such as the large Roman edifices, houses, those great bridges, and those tough Roman roads we've all heard about. But how did they make this amazing concrete of theirs? Historians tell us that their magic formula for opus caementicium was to add a volcanic dust called pozzolana to a mortar that was made from lime or gypsum with bits of rock, brick, tile, and some water added. As many of you know, to mix concrete you have to add each part carefully, making sure not to have too much or too little of any one thing. The Romans did just that, perfecting the exact ratio that yielded the strongest concrete. They would mix the mortar and then add to it the pozzolana, and for every 1 part volcanic dust there would be 3 parts lime or gypsum. Historians tell us that the magic was in the volcanic ash because it contained silica and alumina, which together in the mix created a chemical reaction that strengthened the mortar. Voila! Perfect Roman concrete and structures all over the place which would stand up straight for centuries, long after the empire itself had fallen. But as we said, there was a concrete revolution, and during this phase, the Romans would advance their concrete, making it even stronger, and learn how to make it waterproof. The genius who came up with waterproof concrete found that by adding crushed terracotta, that would do the job. In the 1st century AD, they even figured out that by mixing a certain amount of volcanic ash and lime and letting it sit in seawater, that it would harden the concrete over time. That's why you have Roman structures that have stood in the water for 2,000 years that are still standing, whereas modern concrete would deteriorate in the salt water. That concrete is reinforced with steel, too, and steel doesn't like salt water. In fact, Roman marine concrete has been called the most durable building material in human history. So you might now be wondering, if Roman concrete was that good, and it obviously was, why don't we use it now? Well, you can find research out there that indeed tells us that Roman concrete was superior to the stuff we use today. In fact, recent research conducted by the U.S. Department of Energy and scientists at the University of California tell us that the best Roman concrete was not just more durable than modern concrete, but it's less environmentally damaging to make it. One of those researchers said in an interview, "It's not that modern concrete isn't good. It's so good we use 19 billion tons of it a year. The problem is that manufacturing Portland cement accounts for 7% of the carbon dioxide that industry puts into the air. Portland cement is the glue that holds everything together, but the process of making it releases carbon from burning fuel. To make it, you mix silica sand, limestone, clay, chalk, and more, and then melt it together at super high temperatures." Some of those researchers believe that if we go back to using Roman concrete, not only will there be less carbon emissions, but we'll also have longer lasting structures, which is also good for the environment. Surely, we should be going back to the stuff made with volcanic ash. Some environmentally friendly concretes these days do take the Roman route, and the results have been good. Another good thing, according to scientists, is that the world does not have a shortage of pozzolana. One of the reasons we haven't been using marine Roman concrete is pretty simple, and that's because scientists just didn't know for a while what just the magic was. For instance, a study published in the American Mineralogist in 2017 explained to us how when seawater gets into the Roman concrete, the minerals actually toughen the concrete over time, not weaken it. We should add, though, that this toughening process can take a century or two, so modern scientists are working on something that won't take so long. Surely then we can just make it? Well, it's not that easy, because the Romans didn't leave behind the exact recipe, and it seems us moderns have not been able to perfect the process just yet. One scientist said that the recipe for Roman marine concrete was completely lost. Another scientist in an interview with The Guardian in 2017 said more work needs to be done in creating those mixtures. A bit of fine-tuning needs to happen, he said, adding that the challenge is to develop methods that use common volcanic products, and that is actually what we're doing right now. Nonetheless, as we said, that volcanic ash is used in some concretes today. As one researcher put it, engineers are by no means ignorant regarding how good this stuff is. But the one thing we want to have is the concrete that strengthens in seawater, as that's where our modern concrete has a lot of problems. Those scientists are trying hard to reverse engineer marine Roman concrete, but as we speak, we still can't make it like the Romans did. Another researcher said that the Romans got lucky in what rocks they had available to throw into the mix, and in much of the world today you won't find those rocks, so substitutes would have to be found. And at this point it's worth saying that the new school way of making concrete with Portland cement is relatively cheap. So while it might be worse for the environment, businesses will always think about the bottom line. And concrete is big business. So big, in fact, that it said Portland cement accounts for around 5% of human greenhouse gas emissions. That's what an article in Nature.com tells us. And that's why researchers right now are trying to master how to make what's sometimes called one of the most complex substances known in material science. That same article said some progressive companies in the USA are working on the Roman concrete model to help reduce carbon emissions. But it also said those companies are merely bit players in the concrete business. What we need, according to that piece, is everyone in the construction industry to embrace the next generation cement. With that in mind, don't be surprised if we soon start doing it like the Romans did. As one professor told the Washington Post, the Romans formulated a material that still wows us today. Perhaps we'll have to go back to the past to create a better, more sustainable future. According to YouGov, 4% of adult men and 1% of adult women in the US think about the Roman Empire daily. We want to substantially increase those numbers, so we thought we'd take a little trip through time and reveal what caused the momentous rise and disastrous fall of one of history's most famous empires. Was it outside invaders, political corruption, crumbling infrastructure, or tax evasion? The answer may surprise you, although it likely includes a wide variety of factors. Our team of researchers dug through the ruins, read countless books, and conquered numerous territories in an attempt to replicate the events of and understand the inner workings of the Roman Empire. Before we really begin, we should distinguish between Rome and the Roman Empire, which are not the same thing. You see, before Rome was a massive sprawling empire, it was a republic. We recognize that things often happen differently in human history. Monarchies gradually become representational governments, but Rome decided to reverse the order. According to legend, the city was originally founded by twin brothers Romulus and Remus, all the way back in 753 BC. They were rumored to be demigods, the sons of Mars, the god of war, abandoned by a nearby king, and rescued and raised by a female wolf. As is common with brothers, especially those raised by pack animals, a fight broke out between them, either over where the city would be located or who would rule it. Yet, unlike most sibling fights, Romulus ended up killing Remus, thus achieving sole power and giving Rome his name. In yet another version, a woman named Roma, who was traveling in Aeneas's entourage along with other survivors from the sack of Troy, went to the Tiber River and absolutely refused to venture any further in their journey. To show she was serious and underscore her point to the men, she and other women burned all their ships, meaning everyone in the group ended up staying in the Rome area, whether they wanted to or not. Now, assuming that it's unlikely that two demigods raised by a wolf founded a city, and knowing that the aftermath of the Trojan War is still quite unclear, there's a good chance that these stories just may be fabricated. But they contribute to the myths and legends surrounding Rome. What we do know about the beginnings of the eventual mighty empire is that archaeological records indicate that Rome was founded in approximately 625 BC, and it likely started as a small trading center on the banks of the Tiber, and eventually developed into a city. Why and how did this happen? Well, at the time, the areas in which the town was located were called Etruria and Latium. Citizens were organized into multiple villages in the region, and they may have unified to defend themselves against an invasion of neighboring Etruscans. A competing theory suggests that the Etruscan invasion was successful and is actually what consolidated the little villages into the city known as Rome. You see, one of the problems with things that happened in 625 BC is that it's hard to find people who will give you a definitive answer about what took place back then. Regardless of what specific event brought the villagers together into a larger conglomerate, the historical record indicates a lot of upheaval and unification around 600 BC. So it's clear that by that time, Rome had moved on up in the world from its humble trading center origins. As it was setting out on its own and finding itself, much like most college students, Rome underwent several changes in its identity. Until 510 BC, Rome was firmly in its period of kings era, meaning it had established itself as a monarchy. At least 7 different rulers oversaw the city during this time. The kings came from earlier lines of royalty left by preceding civilizations, most notably Etruscan, Sabine, and the Latin lines of kings. Unlike most monarchies, the succession of the 7 kings of Rome was not hereditary. In a nod to the foundations that would eventually enable Rome's transition into a republic, the kings were elected by the Senate. After the legendary first king Romulus, the son of a wolf and the god of war, who admittedly may have been a tough act to follow, Numa Pompilius arrived on the scene. The lines of kings continued to include Tullus Hostilius, who we swear is not a Hogwarts professor but an actual Roman king, Ancus Martius, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, known as Tarquin the Elder, Servius Tullius, and finally, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known as Tarquin the Proud. The last king, or Rex, as referred to by the Romans at the time, was apparently much less beloved than his predecessors. Historians have found evidence to indicate that his rule was widely regarded as tyrannical, with the public largely against him. Well, this came to a boiling point when Lucius Superbus's son allegedly forced himself upon a well-liked noblewoman, Lucretia. Roman residents and nobles alike reacted with rage and wanted Lucius Superbus and his son out of power. Eventually, the king was overthrown, and Rome transitioned into a republic. The word itself derives from the Latin for property of the people, res publica. If you've ever studied for the SATs, you know that it's just one of many words based on Latin roots that will keep you up at night studying for the vocabulary section. The transition to the Republic wasn't out of the blue, as some recognition of people's rights already existed. Rome's very own constitution had already been established during its first monarchical period. After becoming a republic, the city prospered, expanding its borders through military conquests, leveling up its economy and production of goods, and increasing trade with its neighbors. However, this wasn't exactly the fair and balanced representative government that you might be picturing, at least not initially. See, Rome was divided into patricians and plebeians. Patricians were members of wealthy Roman families, and they were the only ones who could hold elected office and religious office. So instead of being ruled by the people at large, the Romans were now ruled by senators and knights, meaning the upper classes held all the power. This made Rome totally different from the republics that exist today. Occasionally, if the upper classes felt it was merited, they could nominate a dictator to guide them through times of crisis, but for the most part, the rule of the patricians held for centuries. However, this wasn't solely achieved through the famed Roman Senate. Although the Senate existed at the time, it wasn't the formal lawmaking body of the Republic. The members were also appointed, not elected, an important distinction from today's legislative bodies. However, the powerful patrician members of the Senate held great sway in society and exercised it over Rome's actual lawmaking groups to get their way. The patricians looked down on the other segment of society, the plebeians, and enacted laws mostly of their own benefit. However, the plebeians, justifiably discontent with the state of affairs, struggled to gain more control within the government of the Roman Republic. From the start of the Republic in 509 BC until 494 BC, the Senate persisted as the only governing body within the state under the leadership of two consuls. That was until the plebeians organized a strike to assume some power. In a victory for both the unions and democracies everywhere, the strike worked. This led to the establishment of several legislative bodies created to give more power to the people. These were divided up as follows. Comitia Centuriata passed laws, made decisions regarding acts of war, and elected consuls, censors, and praetors. The Concilium Plebis, though it started as a ruling body specifically for the plebeians, it eventually expanded its scope of power to make decrees that applied to all people in Rome, including the patricians. The Comitia Tributa was in charge of electing minor officials and was generally in charge of the more local matters, dispensing justice by enacting fines rather than sentences. It was open to all Roman citizens, well, at least those who were free adults in possession of a penis, which was the case in most ancient societies. The two consuls in charge of this all commanded both the Roman military and oversaw the Senate, not unlike the current powers of the President of the United States. However, as opposed to the former Roman monarchs, the consuls had substantial limitations on their powers. First off, they could only serve for 1 year, leaving them limited time to accrue and thus wield power. Second, there were additional magistrate positions within the Roman Republic that also held decision-making power, thereby keeping the consuls in check. To further strengthen the Republic and the rule of law, the Romans decided to codify many new laws at the time. In 451 BC, they came up with something known as the 12 Tables, a collection of laws about politics, as well as private and public affairs. Thanks to continued expansion during Rome's existence as a republic, by 338 BC, this once small city-state was ruling the entire Italian boot-shaped peninsula. Of course, this expansion was far from linear, as they did suffer quite a few setbacks. For example, the neighboring Gauls came in and sacked Rome in 390 BC. However, the young republic managed to build again and take control of all of Italy under the leadership of Camillus, a revered military leader. Further expansion occurred during the Punic Wars, which lasted from 264 BC to 146 BC and were fought between Carthage and Rome. At the time, Carthage was an impressive and incredibly powerful city-state on the northern coast of Africa, approximately located near modern-day Tunis, Tunisia. There were 3 Punic Wars in total. After the first 2, Rome expanded to control the western Mediterranean, including Spain and the island of Sicily. They also defeated one of the greatest generals and military tacticians of all time, the legendary Hannibal. Though he continued to rule Carthage for some time after being defeated by the Romans, his financial and tax reforms enacted to pay back the massive war debt imposed by Rome made him extremely unpopular. He eventually fled east all the way to the court of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey, where he was betrayed and revealed to the Romans. To avoid capture, he poisoned himself. At the end of the Third Punic War, which took place between 149 and 146 BC, Rome finally bested its formidable foe and burned the city of Carthage to the ground. Many surviving citizens were sold into slavery, and this entire region became a Roman province. Simultaneously, Rome also expanded eastward, defeating the once mighty kingdom of Macedonia in the Macedonian Wars, 200 years after Alexander the Great had overseen his own kingdom's rapid expansion. Aside from the increased territory and economic clout that the acquisition of these provinces via military victory gave Rome, they also helped to develop Roman society and culture as a whole. As you may have noticed, if you ever walked through an Italian city, Rome took quite a lot of architectural, religious, and artistic details from the Greeks and integrated them into its society. The Greek pantheon of the gods was given new names and turned into a Roman pantheon. Roman literature got an incredible jumpstart by translating a lot of classic Greek texts into Latin. The writings of Greek philosophers influenced a lot of Roman thinking and philosophy going forward as well. Perhaps this was part of the reason for Rome's relative success. Instead of solely concentrating on burning their captured cities to the ground, though they did that sometimes too, they also acquired a lot of knowledge, art, and new perspectives from the civilizations they conquered. By this time, the Roman military had become a formidable force. The military might and territorial expansion marked Rome as the premier power in the Mediterranean, one of the ancient world's foremost centers of economic activity. Alas, it seems the Roman Republic expanded too fast for its own good. The Republic started to fall apart from within, leading to political instability and eventually civil war. Discontent led to turmoil, reform, and coup attempts, as inequality spread throughout society, thanks to wealthy landowners using their resources and power to push small farmers out of public land. The wealthy patricians also used their considerable force to exert pressure on the government, so the Senate increasingly ended up working in their favor, reversing many of the earlier gains made by plebeians in society. Disagreements among leaders led to factions forming within the government, some supporting plebeians, others patricians, and some military. Gaius Marius, a military leader, became consul in 107 BC and ruled for several terms, acting more like a warlord than a leader. This made him many enemies, and by 91 BC he faced challenges for power, including from General Sulla. Taking advantage of a Roman tradition allowing dictators to be elected occasionally, the upper class elected L. Cornelius Sulla in 82 BC. Despite being a dictator, Sulla surprisingly stepped down in 79 BC. However, the state's growing reliance on strong rulers during times of trouble marked the shift from republic to empire. A lot of Romans ended up wanting to change the status quo. Some took the path of working within the system to try to course-correct the wayward direction of the Roman Republic. This included leaders like the Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who enacted several social reforms during the period of 133 to 122 BC to help the poorest members of Roman society. Unfortunately, they were killed for their troubles, which seemingly discouraged anyone else from trying to help the poor. Others took a more violent approach to political change. In the 1st century BC, Roman Senator Lucius Catiline, along with a whole contingent of Romans who fought for the poor and downtrodden and had become incredibly discontent with the state of Roman society, laid out a plan to overthrow the government. He was about to go through with it when he was discovered by Marcus Cicero, a famous Roman orator who exposed him to the Senate. After his failed insurrection attempt, an army of the Roman Republic chased Catiline into Gaul and murdered him and most of his followers. The Republic became incredibly unstable and was embroiled in endless civil wars. This fostered a further gravitation towards strong dictatorial leaders, and eventually it all came to a head with one man, Julius Caesar. Caesar assumed power in 60 BC and had an ambitious vision for a Roman Empire. He sought to conquer huge swaths of mainland Europe, far away from the Mediterranean countries and the coasts that the Republic had controlled. He started venturing north, and by 51 BC had taken over Celtic Gaul. In addition to power and prestige, this gave him a significant amount of wealth, as he could steal Gaul's resources and people. Though Rome hadn't fully become an empire yet, as the Senate was still in existence, the senators' powers were significantly weakening. This was best exemplified when they ordered Caesar to turn back and forego his conquests of Gaul, and Caesar responded by completely ignoring them and doing what he was going to do anyway. While maintaining immense popularity with the Roman public, thanks to his successful military exploits and popular writings about travel and politics, Caesar continued to rankle other senators and former allies, creating a troubling stir in Roman politics. This was part of the reason he was eventually assassinated in 44 BC. Over 60 conspirators, many of them political officials, gathered together on March 15, now forever called the Ides of March by pretentious people, and stabbed Caesar 23 times during a meeting of the Senate. If the assassins thought the death of the headstrong Caesar would solve their problems and help them get some of their power back, they could not have been more wrong. Due to Caesar's popularity with the people, the public turned completely against the Senate, whose wealthy, out-of-touch members they hadn't exactly loved to begin with. This led to multiple civil wars until a new ruler emerged, Caesar's grandnephew and adoptive son, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, better known as Octavian for short. He took his place and ruled alongside Caesar's former friend, Mark Antony, the Roman emperor, not the Latin singing sensation, and he renamed himself Augustus Caesar, a nod to his adoptive father. When Mark Antony was killed during Rome's conquest of Egypt, Augustus remained the sole ruler. This made him the first official emperor of Rome, achieving the ambitious aims of his father. His reign was long and prosperous, lasting 41 years and representing a golden age for the empire. In fact, this period became known as Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace. Before Augustus's ascension, the Roman Republic had undergone a long period of crisis, instability, and turmoil, and the people were quite frankly tired of it. So Augustus's restoration of stability within political institutions was very welcome, even at the price of establishing a sovereign ruler for life. Instead of expanding Roman territories, Augustus traveled through his lands to quell revolts and encourage peaceful coexistence with the people Rome had previously conquered. He then focused his attention on creating stability and prosperity back home. During the Pax Romana, Augustus enacted many social reforms. He wanted to restore his vision of morality in the Roman Empire and passed several laws to discourage adultery and encourage the birth of children. In fact, families with 3 or more children were frequently rewarded, especially if the kids happened to be boys. This contrasts starkly with the promiscuous, indulgent, and downright Epicurean image we have of most Roman emperors today. In some surprisingly progressive moves, Augustus also granted women citizenship and a number of rights, such as the right to inherit property and to manage their own finances. He also provided a path for slaves to gain freedom, though he made it quite clear that there would be a limit on how many slaves could actually become free. Augustus also established a regular census to ensure a fairer taxation system and win the support of even more people. This helped accurately assess the tax burden of the provinces and made collection fairer and more manageable for Roman citizens. Lastly, Augustus created the Praetorian Guard, veterans of the Roman legions and carefully screened and selected to serve as the emperor's bodyguards. Literature, architecture, and art reached an apex during Augustus's reign, and many of the most famous Roman sculptures and writings hail from this period, like the Ara Pacis Augustae, built between 13 and 9 BC. Due to all these factors and his benevolent rule, Augustus was loved by the people both during his reign and after. After his death, he was immortalized as a god, and he wouldn't be the last Roman emperor to be bestowed with this honor. Augustus's rule moved Rome into its imperial period, perhaps the time it's best known for, as after his rule, Rome conquered, well, pretty much everything it could get its hands on. The kingdom prospered and expanded, maintaining power by assimilating many of the people it conquered into its empire, but also, horrifically, making a fair amount of conquered people slaves, working for the construction and advancement of the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, not every Roman emperor was as well regarded, competent, and widely respected as Augustus. Many of you may have heard of the oft-mentioned historical figure Caligula. Known in historical circles as a crazy and violent emperor, Caligula's name eventually became used in modern society as a stand-in for anyone deemed to be extravagantly evil and unstable. Perhaps it came as no surprise to everyone, except him at least, that his life ended via assassination. Caligula had developed an unfortunate habit of sending several members of the patrician class to death on conspiracy charges, whether merited or not. This understandably significantly soured relations between the emperor and his senate. One day in late January 41 AD, Caligula was making his way to lunch through an underground passage in the Palatine when 2 tribunes of the Praetorian Guard, Cornelius Sabinius and Cassius Chaerea, murdered him. Historians doubt that they committed this act entirely by themselves. Several notable Romans, including the politicians Annius Vinicianus, Valerius Asiaticus, and commander Marcus Clemens, were implicated in the plot to assassinate Caligula. However, it seems like no one bothered to investigate all that much after the emperor was killed, a see something, say nothing policy, if you will. So one might say that Caligula's paranoid accusations of conspiracy became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Soon after his death, Claudius was proclaimed emperor in his place. However, here's where Roman history can get a little distorted and unclear and reveal the underlying political games being played as the empire expanded. For example, what if one of the Roman emperors thought that being possibly the worst human being ever to exist wasn't actually all that bad? We are, of course, talking about Nero, another man widely regarded as a stain on the imperial throne of Rome. Known in popular history for playing the fiddle while Rome burned, Nero had actually done quite a lot besides that to piss the Roman population off, according to historians of the time. He emptied the treasury, leaving the city effectively cash-strapped, murdered anyone who dared question this action of his, or really any other action of his, and generally came across like a bit of an ass. In addition, his biographer Suetonius wrote that Nero practiced every sort of obscenity, including incest, animal cruelty, and flat-out murder. When that's what your own biographer is writing about you, perhaps you've taken a wrong turn in life. Over time, historians have started to suspect that the particulars of the stories about Nero may be untrue. For example, the fiddle story is almost certainly fabricated, seeing as the fiddle wouldn't be invented for almost another millennium. But a raging fire did strike Rome at the time. In the summer of 64 AD, a huge blaze leveled 70% of the city's buildings and made half of its population homeless, as reported by Roman historian Tacitus. The shocked, desperate, and angry Roman population looked for someone to blame, and a rumor quickly spread that the already unpopular Nero had ordered the fire to be set in order to rebuild the city to his liking. His contemporaries thought that this rumor would be quite easily believed. After all, people generally aren't likely to give incestuous, homicidal, puppy-kicking monarchs the benefit of the doubt. The other problem was that while this massive conflagration was devastating the city and its people, Nero decided to make his way up to the top of the city walls, dressed in theatrical garb, and recite a poem about the destruction of Troy, while allegedly weeping with emotion as he imagined the beautiful new city that would arise from the ashes. Legends at the time have him strumming an ancient version of a guitar, known as a chitarra, while reciting his epic poem. As you can imagine, this did nothing to endear him to the people currently running for their lives from their destroyed houses, who had already put up with his BS for several years. However, there is one big problem with all of these accounts. They may be somewhat, or even mostly, false. More than that, they may actually be outright propaganda from the time. Part of the problem with relying on historical records about Rome, or really any civilization, is that we have to parse out the biases of the sources. And many modern historians or archaeologists are now questioning if Nero's reputation as one of the most evil rulers of all time is actually deserved. You see, contrary to the popular belief that Nero was disliked by the Roman population, it appears he may have actually been disliked by the elite instead. Unfortunately, Rome elites were the people who mostly shaped how history would be recorded. During his reign, which began when Nero was a very young 17 years old, he enacted tax reforms that pissed off the wealthy but made life significantly better for the lower classes. He also loved games, theater, and entertainment, perhaps why the most infamous story about him has him playing music while reciting a poem, and encouraged such activities amongst the Roman population, organizing events like chariot races. This won him fans among the public, even as it garnered disdain from his fellow wealthy Romans. He also increased the supply of food available to Rome and undertook several important public works projects. In many artworks and coinage of the time, he is depicted as an emperor well-liked by the population at large. So why would the Roman writers, who were Nero's contemporaries, make up so many vicious lies about him? Curator Thorsten Opper of the British Museum points out a simple truth. The sources need to be seen as texts with a clear agenda. Many Roman writers seem to prefer the old days of oligarchical rule in Rome and detested an emperor who seemed to favor the support and wants of the masses instead. Historians have now uncovered evidence that when the fire broke out in Rome, Nero was actually 30 miles away from the city. So not only was it unlikely he was responsible, but he definitely could not have made his way to the top of the city walls and started playing a fiddle or even a chitarra. It's not to say that Nero was a blameless angel. It's very likely he either killed his mother or forced her into ending her life, and he definitely loved partaking in some extravagant spending for himself. However, perhaps painting a depressing picture of the era, neither of these were exactly unheard of acts of monarchs at the time, as killing relatives to secure succession or favor was not all that rare. He also set Christians on fire, blaming them for starting the blaze that burned down Rome. Yet again, though, horrible abuse and mistreatment of Christians was pretty par for the course for Roman emperors overall. So while Nero has been immortalized as an ostentatious, evil, bloodthirsty, unstable, maniacal ruler, the actual problems of his reign and the reason for his eventual downfall seem to have been much more practical and grounded in reality. They also pointed to the issues that would plague the Roman Empire and eventually lead to its collapse. Nero steadily lost the support and favor of Rome's elite over time by prioritizing the Roman people while extravagantly spending tons and tons of money. Simultaneously, he was tasked from the age of 17 with overseeing and holding together a massive, sprawling empire and dealing with the unrest and revolt that ensued after an empire had enslaved several populations. In one corner of the kingdom, Nero faced a fierce revolt led by Queen Boudicca of the Celts, who completely sacked the Roman outpost of Londinium, forcing experienced Roman soldiers to flee in terror before launching a counterattack. In the other corner, the Parthian Empire, located around the region of present-day Iran, was ready to go to war. These events all happened within a few years, testing the endurance and long-term viability of the Roman Empire. More significantly, Nero also started facing dissent from his own supposed subordinates. The governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, known as Gaius Julius Vindex, with a V, unlike the popular cleaning product, rebelled against Nero's rule. He was joined by the Roman governor of Spain, Servius Sulpicius Galba, who challenged Nero for his power and position. Though Vindex and his forces lost, which led to Vindex killing himself, more and more politicians threw their support behind Galba, as did those in the Spanish provinces. When the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, who essentially functioned as Nero's head bodyguard, also declared allegiance to Galba, Nero, understandably fearing for his life, fled Rome. With almost no support from the Senate, who had just passed a vote declaring Nero an enemy of Rome, the young emperor realized that his reign, and most likely his life, was coming to an end. In an effort to avoid the humiliation of a public execution, he killed himself at age 30. Since he had no official heir, the Julio-Claudian dynasty that his great-great-grandfather Augustus had implemented ended with Nero's death. As a result, Galba took up the mantle of Roman emperor. Even at this relatively early time, the cracks of the Roman Empire were already beginning to show. Ruling over so many different peoples in far-flung territories and keeping together a massive expanse of land in an age of slow communication and travel was a daunting task, at times seemingly impossible. Couple that with dissatisfied occupied people, local Roman rulers who would sometimes decide to make grabs for power, and general political turmoil, and you have the makings of a beginning of the end. For example, the rule of Galba would be short-lived. The year after Nero's death became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, which, as you might have noticed, is a significantly higher number of monarchs than you'd expect to go through in a year. Though the period did actually last a bit longer, amounting to a little more than a year and a half, the quick changes in leadership indicated nothing particularly productive or good going on in the Roman Empire at the time. Let's zoom in on what exactly happened. The year was 69 AD. It was the worst of times, and that's pretty much it. With the endorsement of the Senate, Galba had started his victory march to Rome. Unfortunately, a word that will continue to pop up in the description of Roman emperors from here on, Galba had already acquired a reputation for greed and cruelty. After just 7 months in office, it became clear to the people of Rome that his reputation was well-deserved. He frequently functioned as a judge, jury, and executioner, sentencing noble Roman men to death due to his own unconfirmed suspicions. He would also seize Roman property on a whim and lean into very paternalistic systems in which those loyal to him were allowed to tax and punish others on the basis of political favors. Corruption flourished under Galba, and Roman citizens started to bristle at this new state of affairs. The masses tried to pressure Galba to punish 2 of his most corrupt lieutenants in a show of petty defiance and dismissal of the people's will, reminiscent of a stubborn 4-year-old. Galba promoted them instead. Most infuriatingly and stupidly for his own preservation, Galba refused to pay the Roman legions the salary they were owed. Now, we're far from political experts, but refusing to pay your armies seems like a great way to encourage a coup. After months of ill treatment and no pay, while simultaneously seeing Galba flaunt his corruption and cruelty, the legions in Lower Germany decided that enough was enough, and they proclaimed their own general, Aulus Vitellius, emperor. In a show of solidarity with this new development, the Praetorian Guard murdered Galba in the Roman Forum on January 15th. This marks the second time that the Roman emperor's bodyguards presented more of a threat than protection for the ruler of Rome. It would be far from the last. Galba's body was left in the street after his assassination. To understand how disrespected he was by the time of his death, he lay there for a while until a soldier walked by, recognized who it was, and beheaded him to deliver his head to Marcus Salvius Otho. Who, you might ask, is Marcus Salvius Otho? And why didn't any Romans have simpler names? Though we're unsure of the answer to the second question, the first answer is the soon-to-be second emperor of the Year of Four Emperors. If you were paying attention earlier in the video, you might have recognized a small problem with Otho becoming the second emperor of the year. Generous Aulus Vitellius of the Germans had already been proclaimed emperor by his legions. And as the Roman Empire, like most empires, functions under Highlander rules, there could only be one. So, what's Otho's story? Otho had started as a supporter of Galba but gradually distanced himself as he saw Galba's support wane and his behavior worsen. After Galba was killed, the Senate proclaimed Otho emperor. Seemingly a relatively peaceful and good man, Otho tried to reason with Vitellius and his legions as they marched toward Rome and agreed on a peace settlement. However, Vitellius had no interest in peace, nor did he give up his bid for the title of emperor. Otho realized that he'd have to meet the incoming general with military force and sent his troops out to meet those from Lower Germania. Though his legions initially won some victories, they suffered a brutal defeat at the Battle of Bedriacum. Historical accounts may not be totally reliable, as you've seen so far, but Roman historian and senator Cassius Dio wrote that 40,000 Romans died on the battlefield that day. No matter what the exact number was, it is clear that the Roman losses were devastating. At the time, Otho himself was in Brixellum. A messenger from the bloody battle flew in at top speed to deliver the news, which was so shocking that Otho and his companions didn't even believe it at first. The messenger, clearly fiercely committed to getting this important news across to the temporary emperor, threw himself on his sword to emphasize the seriousness of what he was saying. I don't know, but we're sure there are better ways to emphasize your points in an argument, but people during the Roman Empire seem to frequently resort to self-destruction as a matter of first resort. Now, convinced of the seriousness of his losses, Otho decided he would end his resistance then and there. Though historians believe he might have actually won if he had continued fighting Vitellius's legions, it was clear that Otho thought the cost would be too great. Supposedly, he stated that he would no longer endanger the lives of such brave men who had deserved so well. And then, you guessed it, he killed himself. His loyal soldiers plunged into despair, considering Otho one of the bravest men that they had ever met and an incomparable emperor. It's sad to say that in total, Otho's rule lasted only 3 months, a real shame since, if given the chance, he would have made a pretty empathetic and perhaps great emperor. However, that was not to be. Finally, Vitellius was on the scene, and the Senate, eager to align themselves with whoever had the biggest army and was banging down their door, officially endorsed him as the newest emperor of Rome. How would he do? Well, pretty terribly. Unfortunately, before he even got to the city, Vitellius started acting like a greedy warlord instead of one of the leaders of the greatest empires the world had ever known at the time. He gave his troops free rein to intimidate and harass the locals, ask for, but more accurately plunder everything they wanted from villages that they passed through in the countryside of Gaul, and generally acted like a narcissistic despot. Even his pirate-like soldiers shuddered at Vitellius's actions during the infamous Battle of Bedriacum. They viewed the general's absolute slaughter of thousands of Roman troops as unnecessary and inhumane. Vitellius, on the other hand, apparently had no problem with the endless rotting corpses strewn before him on the battlefield. He was said to exclaim, "The odor of a dead enemy was sweet, and that of a fellow citizen sweeter still." You may recognize those words as the words of a sociopath. Soon enough, Vitellius made it clear that he had no respect for Roman rule or tradition. He declared himself above it all, gave himself supreme power, and behaved in a completely tyrannical way, with frequent and pointless executions. Unfortunately, as long as he kept his legion's loyalty, he remained in power. Fortunately for Roman citizens who wished to remain alive and unexecuted, he only managed to do this for 8 months. Soon enough, tired of Vitellius's cruel excesses, another Roman legion commander decided to challenge him for the throne. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, better known as Vespasian, was leading Roman legions in Judea to suppress a Jewish revolt, while Vitellius was losing supporters left and right. Vespasian's legions and those of Syria and Alexandria declared him emperor and swore to fight for him. More legions, including Moesia, Pannonia, Illyricum, and Danube, soon followed. The combination of all those different Roman troops amounted to a formidable force, and Vespasian ended up sailing back to Rome with a massive army behind him. The legions under Vespasian were led by Antonius Primus. They easily crossed and took over northern Italy before they encountered Vitellius's legions in October. Perhaps fittingly, the fight once again took place at Bedriacum, making it the second Battle of Bedriacum. Men on both sides fought through the day and night, resulting in many losses. As the story goes, a small, seemingly ridiculous understanding ended up guaranteeing victory for Vespasian's forces. One of the legions under Primus had come from Syria, where after years on the ground, the men had picked up some local customs. One of them was saluting the sun at dawn. After fiercely battling through a long and bloody night, and perhaps not with the clearest of minds, Vitellius's forces saw this salute and concluded that Primus's men were in fact saluting incoming reinforcements. Exhausted, badly injured, in a state of disrepair, they fled the battle, with Vespasian's troops pursuing them all the way to Rome. Even after Primus's and Vespasian's troops entered the city in December, Vitellius's legion still tried to mount a last-ditch effort. They trapped the incoming men in the winding streets of the Roman capital and threw objects, including tiles from the surrounding rooftops, to kill them. Though many men died as a result of the violence within the city walls, 50,000 according to Cassius Dio, who was apparently spending that particular year as Rome's unofficial body counter, in the end, resistance was futile. Realizing that his time had come, Vitellius tried to escape the city disguised in rags, but Vespasian's men recognized and captured him immediately. They dragged him along the sacred way and displayed him in a show of public humiliation at the Forum, where a crowd hurled abuse at him. The legions then tortured him on the stairs of wailing, which is a thing that apparently needed to exist at the time, and after dragging him through the streets of Rome yet again, this time with a hook instead of a noose like the first time, for a bit of variety, they threw him into the river, but not before severing his head, which they then paraded through the city. We cannot emphasize enough how much the Romans really hated Vitellius, and how becoming a Roman emperor was apparently becoming more of a life shortener than smoking Marlboro Reds. On December 22, 69 AD, the Senate finally declared Vespasian emperor. This would signify the end of a protracted period of Roman turmoil and the beginning of a new, more powerful and prosperous era of imperial Rome known as the Flavian dynasty. Under Vespasian's rule, the Colosseum was constructed, unaware as of yet of the throngs of tourists that would one day stampede through its walls, shouting, "Are you not entertained?" at their exhausted families. Vespasian was an intelligent ruler and a good politician, making sure to restore not only the rule of law that Vitellius had completely disregarded, but also to take care of both the people of Rome and its elite class. He fully restored the power of the Senate and enacted several reforms focused on public welfare. As well regarded as the Flavian dynasty was, the year of 4 emperors troubled many Romans. It reminded them that despite the golden age Augustus had presided over as the first emperor of Rome, there was still a fundamental problem with empires and monarchies, namely, that the welfare and safety of the population often depended on the mental stability and the character of whoever's in charge. And if you're dealt a bad hand, that's it for life, or until assassination. Augustus had managed to claim and consolidate power thanks to the internal failures of the Roman Republic, and he had held on to it because of his shrewd political moves and the care he took of his people. Subsequent emperors had already started to disappoint the Roman public, and more upheavals would soon come. However, for the time being, as long as Rome continued to expand and conquer new lands, the empire's star was still rising. The Roman legions were a big reason for the Roman expansion and overall success. Known for their incredible discipline, the armies of the Roman Republic moved away from the classic formation of their neighboring civilization, the Greek phalanx. The phalanx proved unwieldy for battle due to the landscape of most of central Italy, consisting of endless hills and valleys. Instead, the Roman legions were composed of relatively small infantry units, known as maniples. Each maniple had 120 men in 12 files and 10 ranks. At times of battle, maniples were arranged in 3 lines of 10 in a checkerboard pattern. That way, the lines were flexible, and the first line could fall back into a defensive formation with the second line if required, or alternatively, the second line could reinforce the first. Gradually, a new, larger unit known as a cohort replaced the maniple. Each had around 360 men, and around the time of Julius Caesar, every legion would have around 10 cohorts, 4 in the front, followed by 2 lines of 3 cohorts each. While this added up to 3,600 men, this only included the heavily armed infantry. The cohorts usually had supporting forces of light infantry and cavalry, bringing the total number of each legion up to around 6,000 men. To put a visual on these large numbers, when 7 legions would go into battle, a not uncommon occurrence, there would be about 25,000 heavily armed infantry stretched out over 1.5 miles. That's a length of just over 26 football fields. An interesting change occurred when the tide of war shifted, and Rome eventually found itself on the defensive side, protecting against invasions rather than invading others to conquer their land. Cohorts were increased to 500 to 600 men each, meaning each legion now had around 5,000 to 6,000 heavily armed infantry troops alone, with cavalry and light infantry composed of archers, slingers, and javelin men functioning as a backup. When the Roman legions started encountering barbarian armies mounted on horseback, they increased the proportion of cavalry to counter these new mounted troops. Thus, cavalry went from 1/7 of an average legion to 1/4. In the 4th century AD, the Romans instituted catapults and ballistas as part of their legions to enhance their defensive capabilities. In addition to the Roman army's unique formation and strict discipline, the legion's weapons provided another big advantage in battle. The pilum and gladius were two of the most popular weapons for infantry soldiers at the time. The pilum was a javelin measuring 7 feet or just over 2 meters, and the gladius was a type of sword about 20 inches or 50 centimeters long. These weapons enabled Roman soldiers to excel in hand-to-hand combat and fighting at a distance with javelins. In addition, the Romans had strong defensive equipment that helped protect them in battles. Items like metal helmets, shields, and cuirasses, or breastplates and backplates fastened together and meant to protect the torso, reduced the amount of damage Roman soldiers took to the head and body. Roman technological advancements helped not only on the battlefield but also in the development of civilization itself. One of the major contributions of the Roman Empire to the world, for example, was the rapid development of engineering practices. Even today, ancient Roman aquifers still survive in parts of Italy and the former Roman territories. The Romans built sophisticated underground sewage systems, enabling not only a primitive form of plumbing to exist, but also improving their city's general hygiene and cleanliness, as waste flowed underground instead of being left on the streets. Part of what enabled Roman engineering marvels was the development of cement and concrete as building materials. The combination of such materials created structures that have stood the test of time, which is part of the reason for the prevalence of Roman ruins throughout the modern world today. By far one of the best achievements of the Romans, and one that helped not only their military expeditions, but also the impressive development of their trade routes, was the Roman road system. Two of the most famous roads, Via Appia and Via Egnatia, enabled the exchange between Rome and Brindisi and Rome and Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, not Constantinople. You can still find remnants of the Appian Way in Italy today, and Ignatia Odos, translated from Greek as Ignatia Street, still runs through the major Greek city of Thessaloniki. As the Roman Empire grew, this extensive road system helped keep the disparate parts of this grand civilization connected. This helped to maintain the precariously large Roman Empire, as did the taxation system. You see, when Rome conquered a new territory, a lot of the residents of the region would become Roman citizens and would be taxed as such. In addition to newly obtained local resources, this increase in the tax base helped grow the empire's wealth. At its peak in 117 AD, the Roman Empire encompassed a lot of the northern African coast, Asia Minor, and most of Europe. This meant that the lands of Rome stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Euphrates River, with the northernmost borders of the empire found in Britain. However, the seeds of Rome's undoing had already been planted. The precariousness of the imperial throne, the reliance on imperial conquests for wealth and forced labor, the challenges associated with ruling such a massive area, as well as the class divisions that had pestered Rome since the beginning. All of these factors started to combine into a toxic mix. With the Roman Empire stretched so wide, it was also stretched incredibly thinly. No matter how well the Roman road systems worked, there were no 747s in operation or Zoom meetings to enable oversight of such a large empire. Once Roman expansion stopped, in some cases because they had literally reached the end of a landmass, two major problems materialized. First off, Rome had always relied on its militaristic expansion to enslave a portion of the newly conquered population, and they used forced labor to maintain infrastructure, build the empire's engineering marvels, produce food, and just generally keep the system running. Once the empire became overextended and new conquests ground to a halt, the incoming supply of enslaved labor was halted as well. Though this was undoubtedly good news to all the neighbors of the Roman Empire who wished to remain free, i.e. everyone, it started an era of declining labor force in Rome. Second, the acquisition of new territories and a new tax base from the conquered people, who became citizens instead of slaves, continuously imparted wealth into the Roman Empire. Without the acquisition of new wealth, the Roman economy started to stagnate. Even worse, the heavily armed, formidable Roman legions still had to be funded during the period, as even though they weren't actively fighting to conquer neighboring lands, they still had their hands full, defending the empire from revolts and neighboring invasions. That meant that the army required increasing resources in its valiant attempt to hold Rome's borders together while avoiding acquiring more wealth and land. Defensive spending coupled with no economic growth created a further problem Funds had to be diverted away from the empire's other needs and into the military. Rome's military overspending in its waning years were not only to soldiers but also to engineering feats, like Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain, meant to keep potential invaders away and alleviate some of the pressure on Roman soldiers to defend the border. However, this meant that maintaining the complex, advanced infrastructure built within Rome became a secondary goal, and the empire's irrigation, sewage, and road system started to slide into disrepair. This decreased both the quality of life for the average Roman citizen as well as their trust and pride in the emperor and the Senate, as it was clear that citizens' needs were not being prioritized. Some scholars argued that the Roman emperors of the time period had to extract more and more taxes from the population to fund the army. This actually led to fewer people being able to pay the taxes, eventually wiping out the middle class, while the rich moved their homes outside of the city and sought to evade taxes. There's significant debate about how much this actually affected the Roman economy of the time. However, much evidence suggests that coin hoarding became common throughout the empire in this era to help avoid taxes. Meanwhile, a political system that had started to rely on ascension via homicide was also becoming problematic. As the empire grew, becoming emperor of Rome almost guaranteed a shortened lifespan. The crisis of the 3rd century started in 235 AD, and it was exactly as fun as it sounds for everyone involved. The emperor at the time, Severus Alexander, had ascended to the throne at 14 years old. Despite that, his reign had been peaceful and a prosperous one overall. However, he was very ill-suited for battle. Unfortunately for him, Rome's neighbors were starting to poke at the empire's borders. Starting in 231 AD, the Sasanian Empire invaded Roman lands, followed by numerous invasions by the neighboring Germanic tribes between 234 and 235 AD. As empathetic and conscientious a ruler as Severus was, he was an incredibly inept general. His troops started to resent him, and their military discipline fell apart. Eventually, in March of 235 AD, Maximinus Thrax, along with his legion, mutinied and assassinated Severus Alexander. Naturally, according to the rules of the time, that made him the next emperor. On a side note, we don't recommend this method for acquiring any job of your dreams. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Maximinus would not go on to have a long and prosperous reign. Instead, his ascension started the crisis, almost 50 years of utter anarchy, in which military leaders fought and killed each other to ascend to the throne. Rulers died under mysterious circumstances. Disease, revolts, and fires plagued the land. Persecution of Christians also ran rampant during this time. More than 25 men took power during this period, almost all of them dying by assassination. Worse yet, the people tasked with protecting the Roman emperors, the Praetorian Guard, were actually the murderers most of the time. Without stable and peaceful leadership, corruption ran rampant throughout Rome, including in its Senate, and civic participation and pride failed miserably. Things got so bad that one time the Praetorian Guard assassinated a Roman emperor and named the next one based on the highest bidder. Some rulers' reigns only lasted for a few days or weeks, though the exact time span of some of the reigns is uncertain. It appears the record for the shortest reign goes to the father and son team of Gordian I and Gordian II. The pair revolted against Maximinus in April of 238 AD and were recognized by the Senate. A whole 22 days later, Gordian II was killed by legions loyal to Maximinus, and Gordian I, who was the ripe old age of 80, killed himself as soon as he heard the news. 1 month later, Maximinus himself was killed by his own men, so defeating the Gordians ended up being a bit of a Pyrrhic victory after all. The era of imperial crisis ended in 285 AD and was followed by the Tetrarchy. Diocletian, the emperor of the time, initiated a split of the Roman Empire into the western and eastern sections. Splitting the empire was an attempt to make this large bureaucracy more manageable, with Diocletian appointing junior rulers, resulting in 4 separate rulers functioning all at once, which is what gave this period the name Tetrarchy. 2 Caesars ruled the Roman Empire under 2 Augusti because Romans liked using names of former rulers as formal titles in order to confuse future history students. Diocletian theoretically co-ruled with Maximian, a military colleague he appointed Caesar in 285 AD, though in practice, Maximian always functioned as a subordinate. Perhaps since he had come from humble origins, he felt he owed Diocletian a favor and should follow his rules. Then in 305 AD, Diocletian did something quite rare for a Roman Empire. He let go of the throne without being assassinated or just dying. Feeling increasingly weak and overwhelmed, he gave an emotional speech in which he explained that the empire should be ruled by someone stronger than him. As Maximian worked for Diocletian for all intents and purposes, this meant he had to abdicate as well. However, instead of a peaceful transfer of power ushering in a new era of prosperity, it instead plunged the empire into civil war. One man known as the future Emperor Constantine finally emerged victorious in 312 AD. He killed his co-emperor Maxentius at Milvian Bridge, and once again, the Western Roman Empire had one and only one ruler. Wanting to lead the entire Roman Empire once more, Constantine also defeated the Eastern ruler and ended up ruling over a united empire. However, he acknowledged the slight separation that had formed between the empire's two geographical segments by establishing the capital of Constantinople, named after himself, in the east. Constantine is also famous for being the first Roman emperor to establish Christianity as the empire's official religion, as opposed to former rulers who had persecuted this, at the time, new wave religion. Even Diocletian and Maximian had ordered the closing of churches and the burning of Christian scriptures just a few years before. Constantine ruled until 337 AD, when he died of natural causes. After his death, the running of the empire was handed over to his three sons, the unimaginatively named Constantine II, Constans I, and Constantinius II. Once again, power struggles emerged with the three rulers at the helm. Constantine II and Constans I fought a vicious war for power, which resulted in Constantine II's death. Constans I's victory was short-lived, as the Roman legion soon declared a military man named Magnentius as the emperor, who promptly killed Constans I. Just 3.5 years later, Magnentius killed himself after losing a battle, thus allowing Constantius II, the sole remaining son of Constantine, who had been ruler of the East during Magnentius's rise to power in Rome, to take full control. Then a fever in 361 AD came and wiped Constantius II out as well. The next man to ascend to the throne, Julian, was a cousin of Constantius II. He ruled for only 2 short years before succumbing to injuries during a battle against Persia. However, he remains known to this day for being the last emperor to rule over a pagan Rome, as he decided to reverse the empire's stance on Christianity. After Julian's death in 363 AD came the Valentinian dynasty, marked by power struggles, usurpations, assassinations, and overall turmoil. Eventually, Theodosius I, who had started in 379 AD as an emperor of the East, ruled over a united Roman Empire once again after the death of Valentinian II, the Western ruler, in 392 AD. However, this united Roman Empire would be short-lived. Theodosius I died just a few years later in 395 AD. This marked the final split of Rome between Theodosius's sons, Arcadius and Honorius, after the area had been split and resplit several times over the last few decades. The final division lay between the East, ruled by Arcadius, which would become the Byzantine Empire, and the West, ruled by Honorius, which would become, well, nothing at all pretty soon after. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to thrive while the West quickly crumbled. In fact, the prosperity of the East may have hastened the collapse of the West. Though the two smaller areas could theoretically be managed more easily now, they also had to coordinate military funding and resource allocation, which they failed to do spectacularly. When outside forces like the Germanic tribes threatened the empire, the two sides could not cooperate well enough to swiftly take action. Over time, the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire grew in wealth, while the Latin-speaking West experienced an exacerbated economic crisis. Constantine and subsequent emperors of the East had made sure to fortify the city well and keep legions stationed around its wall. The Byzantine Empire's wealth helped shore up those fortifications. Nearby invaders, seeing Constantinople's power and strength as opposed to Rome's weakness and ruin, became more likely to attack the West for an easier victory. In contrast, the Eternal City, the place that had once stood as a symbol of the mighty Roman Empire's power, was falling apart internally and physically as its infrastructure crumbled. But what happened to the formidable and well-armed Roman legions? How could the empire have crumbled so quickly while these impressive soldiers were out there defending Roman lands? Well, in later years, such as during the reigns of the emperors Diocletian and Constantine, the increasing challenge of keeping the Roman legions well-funded and able to fend off revolts and outside attacks created the need for mercenaries. Emperors would recruit soldiers from various neighboring factions, including the Germanic Goths. A strange arrangement, as they had frequently fought with them in the past. However, it was clear that desperate times called for desperate measures. The Goths fought well enough, but the problem was they didn't have any particular reason to be loyal to Rome. They were, as most mercenaries, just in it for the money. In fact, some of them became very resentful toward the Roman Empire, and for justifiable reasons. When one of the biggest invasions to date occurred in the area, the rampage of the Huns across northern Europe in the late 4th century, many Germanic tribes fled south into the Roman Empire. Otherwise, they faced potential slaughter by the Huns. On the other hand, they ended up dealing with harassment and flat-out abuse in Rome, a real between-a-rock-and-a-hard-place situation. Though tribes like the Visigoths were allowed to cross the Danube into Roman territory, the Romans made it clear that they would barely be tolerated within the empire's borders. Historian Ammianus Marcellinus notes that while the Visigoths were starving, Roman officials would give them dog meat, but sometimes only in exchange for forcing the Visigoth children into slavery. The Roman treatment of the Goths became too cruel to bear, and eventually a fierce revolt occurred, ending in the obliteration of a Roman army in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, and the murder of Eastern Emperor Valens. The fact that Goths were also serving in the Roman army at this point probably did not help the Roman legions win any victories, as it's unlikely they would have stayed to fight against their brothers. Genuinely perplexed as to why the people they had fed dog meat to in exchange for making their children slaves held such resentment against them, the Romans scrambled to negotiate a truce. However, by 410 the Goths were over any idea of peace, and the Goth king Alaric, a great name for a no doubt terrible band, had had enough. He marched west and sacked the city of Rome with the help of several Goth soldiers who had spent time serving in the Roman army and learning all their techniques and formations. Though the empire would hold on for a little bit longer, it was nothing more than a dying gasp. Neighboring Goths, the European tribes, not the Marilyn Manson fans, repeatedly attacked the empire until one of the tribes, the Vandals, burned it all to the ground in 455 AD. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had crumbled. Perhaps fittingly, the very last emperor of Rome was named Romulus, an echo of the very first emperor of Rome. After being defeated by a Germanic general named Odoacer, he was thrown out but allowed to live out the rest of his life in exile, going out like the rest of the Western Roman Empire, not with a bang but a whimper. Did you know most of these details about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire? If not, what surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And in the meantime, watch What Caused the Roman Empire to Collapse, or this one instead.